Hello everyone. I'm your narrator, here to guide you through this story today. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let's dive into the story. Jenny's words sliced through my sleep like a knife. "Please, don't touch me," she murmured, her voice small and desperate. My eyes snapped open in the darkness of our bedroom. I froze, listening to my wife's breathing beside me. She was still asleep, but her face was tense, etched with distress. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Then, I noticed the blankets at the foot of the bed lifting slightly, as though someone, or something, was carefully pulling them up. But there was nothing there. My heart pounded against my ribs. This wasn't the fan. This movement was deliberate, concentrated. My eyes followed as a slight indentation formed at the edge of the mattress, as if someone were sitting there. The weight shifted the bed ever so slightly. "Get away," Jenny muttered, turning her head on the pillow. Her eyes remained shut, but her fingers clutched the sheets tightly. I wanted to wake her, but my body wouldn't move. My throat felt tight, as though something invisible was choking me. The indentation on the mattress deepened. Whatever was there was getting heavier. A car passed outside, its headlights casting brief beams through the blinds. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow where there should have been nothing, an unnaturally dense patch of darkness at the foot of our bed. But as the light faded, there was nothing visible. Only the blankets, still unnaturally raised. My hands trembled as I reached for the lamp on the nightstand. I had to see what was happening. But before I could switch it on, Jenny's body stiffened beside me. "Leave," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. But it was different now, not fearful, but angry. "This is not your place. You have to go." The indentation on the mattress vanished. The blankets fell back into place. But the air in the room grew so cold that I could see my breath condensing in front of me. Jenny's eyes flew open, and she sat up with a gasp. "What's wrong?" she asked, staring at me. "You're as pale as a ghost." I told her what had happened, watching as her expression shifted from confusion to fear. Slowly, she began to recall fragments of her dream. She said she had dreamed about her grandmother. Not the real one who had passed away while Jenny was in college, but a distorted version of her. This figure had been trying to climb into bed with us. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, we stayed up with all the lights on, drinking coffee and trying to convince ourselves it had all been just a bad dream. But deep down, we knew better. Something had been in our room. The shattered door hung loosely on its hinges as I pushed it open. The creak echoed across the empty field behind the old family home. It had been 25 years since I'd last stepped into this barn, but the damp, musty smell was exactly the same. A mix of mildew, rust, and something else, something darker. I stood in the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the wooden slats. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by thin beams of sunlight. The barn seemed smaller than I remembered, but no less imposing. The real estate agent had insisted I inspect every structure on the property before listing it for sale. And this was the last stop. Just a quick walk through, I told myself, then I can head back to Chicago and forget about this place all over again. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. Broken farming equipment was scattered everywhere. An old tractor with no wheels, rusted tools whose names I didn't know, empty feed sacks rotting in the corners. Everything you'd expect in an abandoned barn. But then it happened. Something made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, a sensation, like I was being watched, or remembered. I pulled out my phone and used its flashlight to sweep the walls. That's when I saw the first name carved deep into one of the wooden posts. Right at chest height, Michael P. Below it, another name. And more names stretching along the beam, some so old they were nearly worn away. My hand trembled slightly as I moved the beam of light higher, following the trail of carved letters. And then I froze. There it was, unmistakable, David Reynolds. My name. In my own handwriting from when I was 12 years old. But I had no memory of ever carving it. None. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Something dropped from the hayloft above, floating through a ray of light that seeped in through a hole in the roof. I walked over and picked it up. It was an old, folded photograph. The image showed a man standing in front of this very barn, but his face had been violently scratched out with deep, furious marks, like someone had taken a knife to it. My throat went dry. I suddenly remembered my Aunt Clara's warnings from when I was a kid. How she'd grab my arm and pull me away any time I got too close to this barn. "That place is cursed," she'd whisper. "It's been that way since before you were born." We all thought she was just being dramatic. But now... A faint thud came from above. My pulse quickened. Probably just a bird, I told myself. But still, I aimed the flashlight toward the hayloft. There were more photographs scattered across the wooden floor above. Dozens of them. The ladder to the loft looked barely stable. Some of the rungs were rotten or completely missing. But I had to know. I tested my weight on the first step, which seemed solid. It held. Slowly, I started to climb. The loft smelled worse than the ground floor, musty, decaying, with a strange, indescribable darkness hanging in the air. My flashlight revealed more names carved into every surface, and more photographs. So many photographs, arranged like some kind of twisted art installation. Each photo showed different people, and every single face had been violently scratched out. I picked up another one. This one was newer than the first, probably from the 1980s judging by the clothing. A family posing next to a car, their faces obliterated. Another photo showed what looked like a high school graduation. Another, a wedding. All of them were destroyed in the same way. My foot hit something solid. It was an old metal box, though surprisingly not rusted, locked with a heavy padlock. I picked it up, but nearly dropped it when I heard a new sound from below. This wasn't footsteps. It was a dragging noise. A scraping. I aimed the flashlight toward the ladder. Nothing. But then the sound came again, closer this time. My heart pounded against my ribs. The temperature in the barn seemed to drop by 10 degrees in an instant. Clutching the box under my arm, I ran down the staircase without caring about the creaking wood. My foot went through a rotten step, but I pulled it out and kept descending. The dragging sound followed me, but I refused to look back. I burst out of the barn into the afternoon sun, gasping. The door slammed shut behind me with a crash that echoed across the empty fields. I stood there for several minutes, just breathing, the metallic box weighing heavily under my arm. Back in my rental car, I examined the box more closely. The lock was old but sturdy. I need tools to open it. As I drove back to the hotel, I glanced at the barn in the rearview mirror. It looked like nothing more than worn wood and shattered windows. But something moved in one of those windows, a shadow where there should have been nothing. That night, I called my Aunt Clara from the hotel room. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. "You went to the barn," she said bluntly. "How did you know? I told you to sell that place and never look back. Some things need to stay buried, David. I found my name carved there, Aunt Clara. Photographs. And this box. What really happened in that barn?" There was silence so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, finally, she spoke. "It started before you were born," she said. "People went missing, not from town, but drifters. They were never found. Sometimes their cars turned up on the old road behind the farm." My mouth went dry. "What are you saying? Your grandfather wasn't well, David. After the war, something in him broke. He had episodes, days he couldn't remember. Entire stretches of time were just gone. And the barn. Your grandmother tried to protect him, to protect all of us. She locked it up, but he always found a way back. I thought of all the blurred faces in the photographs. My hands started to shake. The police could never prove anything, Clara continued. But people knew. They stopped coming around. Your father moved us away when you were 13. He said it was for work, but really. The box, I interrupted. Did you know about a box? Another long pause. Don't open it, David. Please. Some doors should stay closed. I hung up and stared at the box on the hotel desk. The lock glinted under the lamp's light. I could go back to Chicago tomorrow, toss the box into Lake Michigan, and pretend I'd never found it. I could sell the property as is and let some developer demolish everything. But I knew I wouldn't. I needed to know. Maybe not tonight. But soon. The first thud came at 3:17 a.m. It sounded like a heavy footstep on old wood. Then another. And another. Someone was slowly coming down the basement stairs, at my brother Dave's house. But Dave was in Seattle on business, and I was alone. I sat upright in the guest bed, my t-shirt clinging to my back with sweat. The footsteps continued their slow descent. I grabbed my phone, 7 missed calls from my ex-wife and only 12% battery. I'd forgotten to charge it again. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. A pause. Then they started again, from the top. I'd arrived at Dave's house 3 days earlier, after Karen kicked me out for the 3rd time this year. She'd found the empty whiskey bottles I'd hidden in the garage behind the Christmas decorations. Dave sighed but let me stay. He always did. The footsteps kept their rhythm, down, pause, and back to the top. My hands trembled as I pulled on my jeans. The guest room was on the 2nd floor, directly above the kitchen. The basement door was in the kitchen. I knew the layout well. I'd helped Dave renovate the house 5 years ago, before my drinking got worse, before Karen started finding bottles. I grabbed the flashlight on my phone and the baseball bat Dave had left by the bed. Just in case. The floorboards creaked beneath me as I stepped into the hallway. Each sound felt unbearably loud, competing with the footsteps below. The kitchen was dark, the moonlight filtering through the windows and casting long shadows on the linoleum floor. The basement door was shut, its outline barely visible in the dim light. The footsteps, steady and mechanical, came from behind the door. My throat was dry. I needed a drink. The thought came automatically, followed by the familiar wave of shame. Focus. The footsteps were the problem now. Focus on the footsteps. I pressed my ear against the door. The sounds were clearer now, heavy boots on wood, moving with a methodical precision, down, pause, and back to the top. And then they started again from the top. The wood didn't creak the way it should under that weight. The footsteps sounded off. My phone vibrated. Karen's name flashed on the screen. It wasn't the right time. I declined the call, and my battery dropped to 11%. The doorknob felt cold against my palm. I gripped the bat tightly, my thumb brushing the spot where the tape had worn thin. The footsteps kept their rhythm, indifferent to, or unaware of, my presence. I pushed the door open. The hinges let out a screech. I should have oiled them last year when Dave asked. The basement stretched out before me, a gaping maw of absolute darkness that swallowed the weak light from my phone. The footsteps stopped. The silence pressed against my ears. I could hear my own breathing, too fast, too shallow. Sweat slid down my back. The basement air carried the scent of old wood and concrete dust. Then, the footsteps started again from the top. But now, I could see the stairs, illuminated by my phone. They were empty. The light outlined each of the 14 steps. I remembered that number from the renovation. Each step was made of unfinished, bare wood because Dave always talked about carpeting them someday. Nothing moved on the stairs. Yet the footsteps descended. Thump, thump, thump. They reached the bottom, paused, and began again from the top. My light revealed nothing, just the empty stairs. But someone, or something, was walking down them, over and over again. I placed my foot on the first step. The wood creaked beneath my weight, a sound completely different from those phantom footsteps. Mine were heavier, more definitive. My phone's battery dipped to 10%. I took another step down. The footsteps continued their pattern, passing through the space where I stood. No shift in temperature. No brush of movement. Just the sound of boots on wood. 3 steps. 4. The basement's darkness pressed in tighter. My phone's light caught the edge of Dave's workbench at the bottom of the stairs, his tools hanging in neat rows on the wall, exactly where they should be. 9 steps. 10. My phone flashed a low battery warning, 9%. The footsteps reached the bottom again, paused, and they started again. I reached the basement floor. The concrete was cold beneath my socks. I had forgotten my shoes. Light swept across the space. Dave's workshop occupied half of the basement, tables cluttered with projects in various stages of completion. The other half was for storage, boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture, Karen's craft supplies from when she used to visit. The footsteps above me echoed now, descending, pausing, then starting again. My light found something on Dave's workbench, a piece of paper pinned under a hammer. It was his hurried but legible handwriting. "John, I had to leave earlier than planned, business emergency. Make yourself at home, but don't go into the basement. It's very important. I'm serious. I'll explain when I get back. Dave." The footsteps continued their rhythm. My phone dimmed to conserve power, 8% battery. I should have gone back upstairs. I should have called Dave. I should have left the house. I should have done anything except what I did next. But I'd spent the past 3 years making bad decisions. Why stop now? I ventured further into the basement. Deeper. The footsteps followed their metronomic pattern on the stairs behind me, the steady beat of boots on wood. My phone's light illuminated more of Dave's workshop. Tools hung perfectly aligned on wall hooks, measured and leveled. Dave had always been meticulous. But something was wrong. The tools didn't match the outlines drawn on the wall. A hammer occupied the space meant for a saw. A wrench hung where there should have been a drill. My fingers brushed the handle. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell like a physical weight. My breathing echoed too loudly in my ears. The hammer felt strange in my hand, too light, almost hollow. Behind me, a new sound began. Not footsteps this time. Metal scraping against metal. It was coming from the storage area. My phone's battery warning flashed, 5%. The light dimmed even further. The scraping grew louder. My phone's beam caught something at the edge of the storage area, a glint where there shouldn't have been one. Metal. In the spot where Dave kept cardboard boxes. I moved closer. The boxes were wrong. From a distance, they looked like cardboard. But up close, I could see the truth. They were metal, painted to resemble moving boxes, decoration containers, and storage bins. Perfect replicas. The scraping came from behind them, rhythmic like the footsteps had been. My phone's light revealed gaps between the metal boxes, openings big enough to peer through. 6% battery. I leaned forward, pressing my eye to one of the slits. The light revealed more metal on the other side, walls extending where the storage room should have been. The scraping grew louder. Something moved in the darkness beyond the metal walls. Something big. My phone died. The darkness was absolute. The scraping stopped. Then, behind me, the footsteps started again. From the top of the stairs. Descending. Pausing. Starting again. I dropped the hammer. It hit the floor with a metallic clang that echoed off the walls. It wasn't concrete. More metal. painted to look like concrete. The storage boxes scraped against one another as something pushed them aside. Heavy footsteps approached, not from the stairs this time but from the darkness beyond the false storage area. I ran. My feet found the stairs in the dark, guided by the muscle memory of having installed them. The phantom footsteps continued their pattern, overlapping mine. The wall was real wood this time. I could feel the difference. 13 steps up. 14. I slammed the basement door shut. I slid the key into the lock. For a moment, the only sounds filling the air were my ragged breathing and the thunderous pounding of my heart. Then, the footsteps began again, descending, pausing, starting over, and beneath them, a new sound, metal scraping against metal, growing louder and more menacing with each repetition. Don't pack shoes. I grabbed my keys and ran. The sun was just beginning to rise when I stopped at a gas station, 50 miles away. My hands trembled as I plugged my phone into the charger and dialed Dave's number. He answered on the first ring. "John, are you okay?" Dave asked. "What the hell is in your basement?" I demanded, my voice shaking. A long pause followed, the echo of the footsteps replaying in my mind, descending, pausing, starting again. "I can't tell you," he finally said. "But I need you to tell me exactly what you saw. And I need to know if it saw you." Behind his voice, I heard something, a familiar sound muffled by distance and the static of the phone. Footsteps descending the stairs. I hung up and kept driving. I haven't stopped since. The bottles are still in the trunk, untouched. I need to stay alert, stay focused, because sometimes, when I let my guard down, I hear them again. Footsteps, descending the stairs, over and over. And beneath them, growing louder, the sound of metal scraping against metal. The next morning, Jenny remembered more of her dream. She said her grandmother, the real one this time, had come to explain. The spirit wasn't trying to harm us. It was another woman who had lived in our house decades ago. In the final years of her life, she had suffered from dementia, often wandering into the wrong rooms, thinking they were hers. Even after her death, she kept returning to what she believed was her bedroom, unable to understand why strangers were sleeping in her bed. Jenny's grandmother had helped her remember who she was and guided her out of our home. I still have the recording from that last night. If you look closely, you can see 2 sets of footprints briefly form on the carpet before fading away, one hesitant and uncertain, the other firm and steady, leading the first toward the door. We stayed in the house, but we moved our bed to a different wall and painted the room a new color, not to ward off spirits. We're no longer afraid, but to truly make the space our own. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think of that confused spirit. Wandering. Searching. Trying to find her way home. I feel deeply grateful to Jenny's grandmother for helping her find peace. This could be told as a ghost story, focusing on the fear and uncertainty we felt. But in the end, it wasn't about fear, it was about compassion, about helping a lost soul find its way home. Jenny no longer has nightmares. She sleeps peacefully through the night, and the foot of our bed remains calm. Yet sometimes, when I wake up at 3:47 a.m., I whisper a silent thank you to both grandmothers, the one who helped and the one who needed help. Then, I roll over and fall back asleep, comforted by the knowledge that our room belongs solely to us. 3 people died in this apartment. In 1954. I know that now. I wish I didn't. I found the listing online, a steal for a 1-bedroom apartment in the heart of Boston. The building, dating back to the 1920s, was made entirely of brick, adorned with intricate moldings. The real estate agent emphasized its historic charm at least 5 times during the tour. What she didn't mention was why the rent was so low or why the previous tenant had left all their furniture behind. I moved in on a Tuesday. The first night was fine. The second night was, too. But on the third night, I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought they were coming from the walls, maybe the pipes or the ventilation system in this old building. But as I lay in bed, the whispers grew clearer. They didn't form actual words, but they had a rhythm, like multiple people were having a conversation just beyond the edge of comprehension. I got up and walked through the apartment. The whispers stopped. The living room felt like a freezer compared to my bedroom. My breath came out in small, visible puffs. I checked the thermostat. 72 degrees. But my hands were shaking from the cold. The next morning, I ran into my neighbor in the hallway, Mrs. Chen from 4B. She was taking out the trash, moving slowly with her cane. "How's the apartment treating you?" she asked. "Fine," I said, hesitating. "Although the heating seems a little uneven." She stared at me for a long moment. "How long have you been there?" 3 days. She nodded slowly. "That sounds about right. Most don't last more than a week." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach dropping. "The cold spots. The whispers. You've noticed them, haven't you?" My mouth went dry. "How do you know that?" "I've lived here 30 years. Seen a lot of people come and go from that unit. No one stays longer than 7 days. Something's not right in that apartment." I wanted to laugh it off, but my voice stuck in my throat. "What happened there?" "Murder-suicide. 1954. A man killed his wife and daughter, then himself. Police found all 3 of them in the bathtub. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old building made me jump. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped again. This time, the cold spot had moved into my bedroom. The whispers started, closer than before. I turned on every light. And I sat in the living room with the TV on, around 4 a.m. The screen started flickering, and the whispers grew louder. Out of the corner of my eye, a dark shadow moved. When the sun came up, I called the realtor. She didn't seem surprised when I told her I wanted to break the lease. She just sighed and said she'd email me the paperwork later that afternoon. I started packing right away. While I was pulling clothes out of the closet, the laughter of a child echoed through the apartment, clear and sharp. Then, a woman's scream rang out, only to be abruptly cut off. I grabbed my backpack and laptop, leaving everything else behind, and ran out. In the hallway, Mrs. Chen stood there again. "A few days," she said. "More than most last." That night, I stayed in a hotel. The next day, I returned with a few friends to retrieve my belongings. But the apartment was completely empty. Not just my things, everything was gone. The furniture left behind by the previous tenant had vanished, too. The rooms were entirely bare, as though no one had ever lived there. The realtor denied that there had ever been furniture in the unit. She insisted I must have been mistaken. But I have photos on my phone from moving day, showing the old sofa, the dining table, the bed. I tried to research any murders or strange incidents in the building, but found nothing in the newspaper archives. I asked Mrs. Chen again, but her daughter told me she had moved to Florida months ago. The current tenant in 4B said they had never even heard of her. Sometimes, I drive past the building late at night. The windows of my old apartment are always dark. But occasionally, if I look at just the right moment, I see shadows moving inside. From the street, I swear I can hear whispers. The "for rent" sign has been hanging there for months. The rent keeps dropping. I wonder how many people have tried to live there since I left. How many made it through the first week? Now I live in a new apartment on the other side of the city, a modern building made of concrete and steel. No history, no charm, no cold spots. I keep the heat on, even in summer. I never browse listings for historic buildings anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers. They don't come from the walls or the pipes. They come from my memory. And I know that somewhere in that old brick building in downtown Boston, in that apartment with ornate moldings and low rent, someone else is hearing them now for the first time. This is probably their last week there because no one lasts more than 7 days. The ghosts make sure of that. The first bang startled me in my chair. It was 11:42 p.m., and I was alone in the building, a former factory-turned-office space, trying to finish the quarterly reports. The sound came from the old machinery section, a sharp metallic clang that didn't belong. My fingers froze above the keyboard as I listened. The renovation company had done a great job transforming the abandoned plant into a modern office space. They'd kept the industrial charm, exposed brick walls, steel beams, massive windows. But they'd left the old machinery area intact, behind a glass partition. It was a dark space, filled with silent, looming equipment, waiting for the second phase of renovation that never came due to budget cuts. Another clang echoed, followed by a dragging sound. My heartbeat quickened. I minimized the spreadsheet on my screen and checked the security system status on the secondary monitor. All doors showed as locked. No motion sensors had been triggered. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight. The office lights cast a warm glow over rows of empty desks. But beyond the glass partition, the machinery zone was cloaked in darkness, save for the faint emergency lights required by code. As I approached the partition, the squeak of my shoes on the polished floor sounded absurdly loud. A new metallic sound rang out, sharper this time, like someone deliberately striking a pipe with a wrench. It came from the farthest corner of the room. The beam of my phone's flashlight illuminated twisting shadows among the dust-covered machines. Nothing moved. But just as I swept the light across the room again, I thought I saw a flicker, a shadow slipping between two drill presses. Logic told me to leave, but a mix of curiosity and inexplicable stubbornness drove me to open the glass door. The air in the machinery zone was noticeably colder. My footsteps echoed off the high ceiling as I navigated the covered forms. Another metallic clang reverberated, followed by a sound like grinding gears. It came from behind an old conveyor system shrouded in grimy plastic. As I got closer, I noticed tracks in the dust on the floor, fresh footprints that hadn't been there before. My pulse raced as I extended a trembling hand. I yanked the plastic away in one swift motion. There was nothing. Just more rusted machinery covered in years of dust. The relief was fleeting. I felt an icy chill behind me, and I turned around slowly. A dark figure moved between two machines, too tall and thin to be human, its proportions utterly nonsensical. Panic took over. I tried to run for the exit, but the shadows seemed to shift at an impossible speed, appearing beside and behind me. Something grazed my shoulder, and the air around me vibrated with a low, mechanical hum. I reached the glass door and flung it open, slamming it shut behind me. Instantly, the sound stopped. Beyond the glass, the machines remained still, the shadows unmoving. But I knew what I had experienced wasn't a figment of my imagination. That was the last night I stayed late in that building. The shadows lurking in the machinery area belong to a time and purpose we can no longer understand, but they're still there, waiting. The first time I heard the laughter was on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was cleaning the kitchen cabinets. It wasn't a cheerful laugh. It was wrong. The sound hit me like icy water trickling down my spine. It was deep, guttural, and somehow, wet. There shouldn't have been anyone in my garage. I live alone in a small house on the outskirts of Portland, Maine. The nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile away. I moved here 6 months ago after my divorce, seeking isolation. The garage is detached from the house, connected by a covered walkway. The previous owner had used it as a workshop. That afternoon, I was immersed in my usual cleaning routine. Marta, my ex-wife, used to say I was obsessive about keeping everything organized. Maybe she was right, but the routine helped keep my mind occupied, away from the silence of memories. I had just finished cleaning the tops of the cabinets when I heard it, a low laugh at first, then growing into a wet, gurgling sound. It seemed to bounce off the walls of the garage and seep through the door connecting it to the kitchen. My hands froze mid-motion on the cabinet door. The laughter came again, longer this time. It was as if someone was trying to laugh while drowning, a horrible, liquid sound that churned my stomach. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep next to the refrigerator. The weight of it in my hands gave me a fleeting sense of security as I headed toward the garage door, my heart pounding hard against my ribs. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm armed, and I've already called the police." I hadn't called anyone, but they didn't need to know that. The laughter stopped. I waited, counting my breaths. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. Just silence. My hand trembled slightly as I turned the doorknob. I flung the door open, the bat raised. The garage was empty. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating my workbench. The tools hung neatly on their hooks. The boxes of Christmas decorations were still piled up in the corner. Nothing was out of place. I checked behind each box, under the workbench, and inside the small storage closet. Nothing. The side door was still locked from the inside, and the windows were sealed shut. "I must be imagining things," I muttered, lowering the bat. "Maybe I'm working too hard." I went back inside the house, double-checking the locks, but I couldn't shake the sound from my mind. That awful wet laugh. The rest of the day passed normally. I finished cleaning the kitchen, prepared dinner, watched some TV. By bedtime, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined everything. Almost. The first scream came at 11:42 p.m. I know because I checked my watch, wanting to mark the exact moment everything went wrong. I was stacking spare auto parts in aisle E47 of the Morgan and Sons warehouse when I heard it, a muffled cry, as if someone had their mouth covered. I froze, holding a box of timing belts. Fluorescent lights buzzed above me, casting harsh shadows between the tall metal shelves that stretched up to the ceiling. Working the night shift, I was used to being alone, accompanied only by the hum of the ventilation system and the occasional beeping of a forklift in reverse. But this sound was different. Human. Wrong. My first thought was that Jimmy from the reception area had hurt himself again. Last month, he dropped a transmission on his foot and screamed so loudly that security came rushing over. But Jimmy's shift ended at 10, and besides this sound, it was too desperate. I slowly set the box down on the ground, trying not to make a sound. The concrete floor felt hard beneath my boots as I stood completely still, listening. For 10 seconds I only heard the usual sounds of the warehouse. Then something caught my attention, a shadow moving between the shelves 3 aisles away, visible through the gaps between the stacked boxes. "Hello?" I called. My voice echoed through the metal space. There was no response. I should have called security right then. I should have pulled out my phone and... I had marked the reception where Mark usually watched his Netflix shows. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear of looking stupid if it turned out to be nothing, or maybe it was pure curiosity. Instead of staying where I was, I started walking toward the place where I had seen the movement. The wheels of my pallet jack screeched as I pushed it aside, and every step I took echoed faintly in the vast space. I passed aisle E48, then E49, moving as quietly as I could, scanning between the shelves. The white labels on the boxes seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. Brake pads, fuel pumps, alternators, everything in its place, except for what was moving in the shadows. Another scream pierced the silence, closer this time, unmistakably from a woman. It was followed by the sound of boxes crashing to the floor and a man's voice shouting, "Shut up!" The words were harsh, angry. My heart pounded against my ribs as I pulled out my phone, my finger trembling over the keypad. But before I could dial, I heard hurried footsteps coming toward me. I crouched down behind a pallet of oil filters just as two figures ran past the end of my aisle. The first was a woman, her blouse torn, dark hair a mess around her face, blood running from her nose, and her eyes filled with terror. Close behind her was a man in dark clothes, lifting her up with gloved hands. They disappeared, turning toward the loading docks. My hands shook as I tried to dial security. I dropped the phone, and it hit the concrete floor with a sound that felt deafening. The footsteps stopped. "What was that?" the man growled. "Check it out," said another voice, low and grave. New steps started approaching, slower, deliberate. They were closing in, slow but steady. A shadow stretched across the floor at the end of the aisle where I was hiding. My heart was racing so fast I could hear it in my ears. I could stay hidden and pray they wouldn't find me, or I could run. Neither option felt good. The shadow drew closer, and I saw the tip of a black boot enter my line of sight. My muscles tensed, ready to bolt. Then, a loud crash sounded from the direction of the loading docks, followed by another scream. The boot disappeared as its owner ran toward the noise. I seized the chance to grab my phone and, with trembling hands, finally dialed security. It rang 4 times before Mark answered. "Reception," he said, sounding bored. "Mark, there are 2 people in the warehouse. A woman, I think she's hurt. Call the police." "What? What are you talking about?" Another crash interrupted our conversation, this time the sound of glass breaking coming from the shipping office. "Just call the police." I hung up. I ran toward the noise, glancing back, unable to explain why I was charging toward danger instead of away from it. Maybe I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to that woman while I hid. Perhaps it was pure stupidity. The shipping office was a small room with windows that overlooked the loading docks. As I approached, I noticed one of the windows was shattered. The glass crunched under my boots. The woman was cornered in the far corner, holding a pair of scissors in front of her like a knife. The man in dark clothing stood between her and the door. "Just come quietly, and it'll be easier," the man said, his voice unnervingly calm now. "Stay away," she retorted, her voice shaking, but her hands remained steady. I frantically searched for something to use as a weapon. There was a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall near me. I grabbed it just as the man lunged at the woman. She slashed at him with the scissors, her cold, blue eyes meeting mine. "Bad decision," he muttered before driving his fist into my stomach. The air rushed out of my lungs, and I doubled over. Then he raised his knee and struck me in the face. Pain exploded in my nose, and I tasted blood, warm and metallic in my mouth. The woman screamed and lunged at him with the scissors. The man turned to face her, giving me a moment to dive at his legs. We collided with a desk, papers and a computer monitor flying everywhere. I tried to wrap my arm around his neck, but he was stronger than me. His elbow struck my ribs, once, twice, 3 times. My grip loosened. He broke free and threw me to the ground. I hit the floor hard, my vision blurry. I saw him pull something from his jacket, a gun. "Enough!" he shouted, pointing it first at me, then at the woman. "Both of you on the floor now." I lay there, gasping for air, blood trickling down my face. The woman slowly knelt, still clutching the scissors. "Drop them," the man ordered. She let them fall, the metal clinking as they hit the ground. Tears streamed down her face, but her eyes burned with hatred. "You should have given me what I wanted," the man said, his voice cold and calculating once again. Then, suddenly, red and blue lights flashed through the broken window, and a police siren wailed in the parking lot. "Police!" a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. The man's head whipped toward the window. In that brief moment of distraction, the woman lunged for the scissors. The man turned and fired. The gunshot echoed deafeningly in the small office, but she had already rolled behind a filing cabinet. The bullet tore through the metal. I dove at his legs again. We crashed together, grappling for the weapon. His mask shifted, revealing a pale jaw covered in stubble. He slammed the butt of the gun into my head. Stars filled my vision. Then, the woman was there, stabbing the scissors into his shoulder. He screamed, and the gun discharged again, the bullet hitting the ceiling. I managed to wrest the weapon from his hand. It slid across the floor, just out of his reach. The man shoved me away. He stumbled, trying to stand up, blood spreading across his jacket from the wound in his shoulder. With a painful grunt, he yanked the scissors out and ran toward the loading docks. The police rushed in through the back entrance, guns drawn. The man jumped onto a pile of pallets and disappeared into the maze of shelves. Gunshots echoed throughout the warehouse. I was lying on the office floor, everything spinning around me. The woman knelt beside me, her voice trembling as she asked, "Are you okay?" Her hands fluttered over my wounds. "I think so," I answered with difficulty. "What about you?" She nodded, and then she began to cry. I slowly sat up and draped an arm around her shoulders as the police ran past, chasing the man. They caught him as he tried to climb the security fence behind the building. Later, I learned the whole story. The woman was an accountant who had discovered evidence of money laundering in her company. The man was a thug hired to silence her. He had tried to catch her outside her house, and she had fled, seeking refuge in what she thought was an empty warehouse. I spent the rest of the night in the hospital, where they took x-rays and stitched up my wounds. Broken nose, 2 cracked ribs, a mild concussion. It could have been worse. The next day, Sarah came to visit me, bringing coffee and donuts. She had a black eye and her arm in a sling, but she was alive. "Thank you," she said, her eyes filled with gratitude for helping a complete stranger. I shrugged, wincing from the pain in my ribs. "I couldn't just hide while something bad was happening." She squeezed my hand. "Most people wouldn't have," she said. Maybe she was right, but as I lay there in that hospital room, bruised but alive, I knew I'd do it again. Not because I'm brave or heroic. I'm not. I was terrified the whole time. But sometimes you have to act despite the fear. Sometimes hiding isn't an option. I still work the night shift at the warehouse. The shipping office window has been repaired, and the bloodstains have been cleaned up. Everything seems normal, but sometimes, when I'm alone among the tall shelves, I remember the sound of those screams, the flash of the scissors, and the weight of the fire extinguisher in my hands. I remember the decision I made. The official report of the incident records it as an attempted kidnapping interrupted by warehouse employee Michael Torres. Just another criminal statistic. But I know the truth of what happened that night. I know how close it came to ending differently. I know how thin the line is between life and death, between acting and hiding. Sarah and I still meet for coffee from time to time. We don't talk much about that night. There's no need to. We both carry the scars, the memories, and the knowledge of what we are capable of, both the good and the bad. It was late at night when I heard unexpected noises coming from the warehouse. Without hesitation, I called security immediately, but I always kept the fire extinguisher close by. Some lessons you only need to learn once. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Fresh coffee, rich and strong, floating in the air. It was 11:43 p.m. when I stopped mid-sentence, my fingers frozen on the keyboard. Something wasn't right. I was working on the 14th floor of the Riverside Business Center, and I was the only one there. I'd been alone for hours. My desk lamp cast a yellow circle on the scattered papers and empty cans of energy drink. Outside the window, the city lights glimmered against the black sky. The cleaning crew had left around 8 p.m. Security had made their round at 10. I had waved at Jerry as he passed with his clipboard. "Burning the midnight oil again," Mark had joked. I had nodded, pointing to the reports I still had to finish before the morning meeting. But now coffee. No, not the stale coffee from the break room that had been sitting there since the afternoon. This was fresh. The kind of aroma that only comes from freshly brewed coffee. I pushed myself back from my desk, the chair creaking in the silence. My heart began to race. It might be nothing. Maybe someone from the cleaning crew had come back for something they forgot. Maybe another workaholic from another department had snuck in. But I knew it wasn't that. The smell was coming from the conference room. A line of light streamed out from beneath the closed door, but I hadn't seen the light turn on. It had been dark in there for hours. I wiped my sweaty palms on my pants and cautiously approached the door, moving silently across the carpet. I pressed my ear to the wood. Nothing. No voices, no movement, just silence. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. The metal was cold to the touch. I turned the handle slowly, a small click echoing in the quiet. I pushed the door open just a crack, enough to peer inside. The fluorescent lights in the room were on, casting harsh white light that made me squint. In the center of the long table, there was a cup of coffee. Steam rose from the dark liquid. One of the black leather swivel chairs was slowly spinning, as if someone had just gotten up. I pushed the door all the way open. "Hello?" My voice cracked. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Is anyone here?" The chair spun just a little more before it stopped. The coffee cup remained, innocent and ordinary, one of those generic break room cups with the company logo. The coffee smelled incredible. I took a few steps closer, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty room. The air was noticeably colder than in my office. A shiver ran down my spine. I leaned over the cup. The liquid was as black as ink, with tiny bubbles around the edge, showing just how fresh it was. "This isn't funny," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice barely convinced me. The silence was the only response. Outside, a police siren howled in the distance. I pulled out my phone and I called reception security. Jerry, it's Mark on the 14th. Has anyone else been through this floor in the last few hours? Let me check the logs." I heard the typing on the other side of the line. "No, just you and the cleaning team earlier. Everything all right up there?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Someone's been in the conference room. It's cold, and there's a low, vibrating noise." Our conversation was interrupted by a hum. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out, leaving only the faint city lights streaming through the windows. Suddenly, the temperature dropped further, enough for me to see my breath. The swivel chair moved again, faster this time. A deep buzz filled the air, vibrating beneath me. In the dimness, I saw something impossible, a vague figure sitting in the dark, misty chair. But it was there, clearly. I ran. I don't even remember how I reached the emergency exit, but I flew down the 14 flights of stairs, my shoes echoing on the concrete. The buzz seemed to chase me, following me. I made it to the lobby, breathless, and Jerry was there. "Mark, what happened?" "The security monitors are showing static, and the elevators." I grabbed him by the arm. "There's something up there, Jerry. Something in the conference room." He nodded, pale. We went together to the monitor room. On the recordings, we saw the lights on the 14th floor turn on by themselves. The chair slowly spun, and a coffee cup appeared out of nowhere. I never finished those reports that night. From time to time, I still work late, but never on the 14th floor. That night, I went through my usual nighttime routine mechanically, brushing my teeth, washing my face, taking my meds, checking doors and windows. I set the alarm as always, and finally fell asleep, but it didn't last long. The noise woke me up at 2:07 a.m., the same laugh, but now it was much closer, much too close. It came from the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. My body froze under the covers, sweat trickling down my forehead despite the cool air from the ceiling fan. The laugh came again, wet and gurgling, like someone was choking on their own amusement. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My eyes were fixed on the thin strip of darkness visible under the door. A shadow passed across that darkness. Something was out there. The floorboards creaked. Another laugh, now right at my door. The doorknob began to turn slowly, so slowly. I lunged for the lamp on my nightstand, my trembling fingers trying to turn it on. The light flooded the room. The doorknob stopped turning. The laughter stopped abruptly. My heart pounded so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, turned on the flashlight, and got out of bed. The bat was downstairs in the kitchen. Stupid, I should have brought it with me. I stood there, what felt like hours, staring at the door with the bat in my hand, sweat soaking my clothes. Finally, I gathered enough courage to yank the door open. The hallway was empty. The motion-activated night light cast a dim glow on the wooden floor. Nothing moved in the shadows. I checked every room on the upper floor, then went down to the first floor. Everything was locked up tight. The alarm system showed no signs of entry. But I knew what I had heard. I spent the rest of the night in the living room with all the lights on. The cold air beat against my face, fluttering as I jumped with every creak and groan of the old house. The morning had finally arrived. The first time I truly felt the heat was as I scraped away at the peeling wallpaper beside the attic stairs. A sudden wave of warmth slammed into my back, as though I were standing too close to a heater. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway and the wooden stairs that led up to the attic. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the strange sensation, and went back to my work, tearing off more wallpaper. But the heat returned, this time even stronger, accompanied by an odd pressure between my shoulder blades, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, I find myself sitting at the kitchen table at 3 a.m., staring at a pile of old family photos I discovered in the attic. My hands won't stop shaking. I inherited this house from my great-aunt Marta 6 months ago, a woman I barely knew. She was the family's loner, the strange sister who never married and never left the property. When her lawyer called to tell me I was her sole heir, I was shocked. I had only visited the house twice as a child, and my memories were hazy, creaky floors, dusty rooms, and Marta shuffling around in her slippers, murmuring to herself. The house was in bad shape, to say the least. The wiring was ancient, the pipes leaked, and the surfaces were caked with decades of grime and peeling wallpaper. I decided to fix it up and sell it for a profit. I took some time off work, moved in with just the essentials, tools, a mattress, and my laptop. The first 2 weeks were fine. I peeled wallpaper, patched up holes, and updated the electrical system. It was tedious but manageable. Then came that day by the attic stairs. After feeling the heat and pressure for the second time, I convinced myself it was just a draft or my imagination. Old houses are known to have weird air currents, right? But it kept happening. Every time I worked near those stairs, the sensation returned. The heat would slowly creep in, growing stronger until sweat ran down my back. The pressure became almost unbearable, like something was pressing against me with all its weight. I started avoiding that part of the hallway, taking long detours to get to other rooms. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from those stairs. Last night, I finally decided to confront it. I needed to check the insulation in the attic, and I was tired of letting this strange fear control me. I grabbed my flashlight and toolbox, steeling myself for whatever might happen, and began climbing the stairs. Halfway up, the heat hit me, pressing my shirt against my back. Instantly, the pressure followed, so intense that I had to grab the handrail to keep from falling. The beam of the flashlight bounced off dusty boxes as I pressed on, determined to face whatever was lurking in the dark. Old furniture, covered with sheets, filled the attic. The air was thick with dust that had accumulated over decades. I forced myself to keep moving forward. The attic was huge, stretching the entire length of the house. Boxes and trunks were stacked everywhere, along with covered furniture and piles of yellowed newspapers. I spotted a box labeled Photos, and grabbed it, hoping to find old pictures of the house that might help guide my renovation. I carried it to the kitchen where the light was better. The box was full of albums and loose photos spanning at least 50 years. At first, they were just typical family pictures, picnics, birthday parties, Christmas gatherings. But then I found one that made me stop. It was a photo of the attic stairs, taken from the hallway. The image was faded and slightly blurry, probably from the 1970s based on the wooden paneling visible on the walls. But what caught my attention was the dark figure standing halfway up the stairs. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or a flaw in the photo. But the more I looked at it, the clearer it became. It definitely had a human shape, but it was completely black, like a cutout of dark paper. The figure appeared to be looking down at the camera. My hands started to shake. I went through the rest of the photos. There were more, many more, different years, different times of day, different angles. But in all of them, that figure was there. Always in the same spot, always looking down. I continued sorting through the photos, spreading them out on the table in chronological order. The figure appeared in each one of the photos of the stairs from 1960 onward, always on the same step, always looking down. On the back of some of the photos were notes, mostly dates and names. But one caught my attention. It was another photo of the stairs, dated 1983. Marta's handwriting said, "It never moves from that spot. I've learned to live with it." I spent the next few hours spreading out the photos and organizing them. The figure seemed to have first appeared in 1960, the year Marta bought the house from the original owners, the Hendersons, who had lived there for 40 years without any strange incidents. Something had changed when Marta moved in, something that brought that figure to the stairs. I pulled out my phone and opened my gallery. 2 weeks ago, I had taken some pictures of the front to document the renovation. I searched for the images of the hallway and attic stairs. My hands trembled as I saw it. There it was, the same dark figure, on the same step, in my digital photos. The sound of wood creaking made me jump. It came from upstairs, heading toward the attic stairs. I froze, barely breathing. Another creak, as if someone had shifted their position on a step. The kitchen suddenly felt too exposed. I grabbed the photos and I grabbed my phone and locked myself in my bedroom, making sure to block the door. I hadn't slept all night, and by morning, with the sun shining brightly, I made my way up to the attic again. The figure wasn't there, at least not visible. But the sensation of heat and pressure returned as soon as I set foot on the stairs. I checked the property records and newspaper archives. In 1960, Martha bought the house shortly after a fire at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Tragically, people had died in that fire, including a patient named James Sullivan, who had been paralyzed and trapped in his third-floor room. According to the article, Martha tried to reach him, but the fire forced her to retreat. She stood on the stairs, watching as Sullivan's room was consumed by flames. The pieces began to fall into place in my mind. The figure on the stairs, always looking down, the unbearable heat, the pressure. It wasn't some random shadow. It was an echo of James Sullivan. Tonight, I plan to do something I never thought I'd need to do. I'm going to try to communicate with whatever is here. I head up to the attic with a flashlight and an old recorder I found in a closet. I pause at the bottom of the stairs, feeling that familiar heat and pressure. "James," I say, my voice trembling. "Nothing. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what happened. It wasn't Martha's fault. She tried to save you." The heat intensifies, becoming almost unbearable. "You don't have to stay here. You can go. It's okay." The air around me suddenly cools, and the pressure lifts. For the first time in weeks, the stairs seem normal again. Tomorrow, I'll call a contractor to seal off the attic. I don't want anyone else to go through this, but tonight, for the first time since I arrived, I feel at peace. The house renovation is nearly finished. I could sell it, but I'm not sure I want to. There's something about this place, something I understand now. Maybe Martha left me the house because she knew I could learn to live with it too. Some presences aren't meant to be feared, only accepted. The figure on the stairs is gone, but sometimes, when I walk down the hallway, I feel a faint warmth on my back. It's not uncomfortable, just watchful. Maybe James has finally found some peace. It all started with a phone call at 2:17 in the morning. I wasn't expecting to hear from my sister at that hour, not because we weren't close, but because we both knew the boundaries of our nighttime routines. "Clara, are you awake?" Her voice sounded muffled, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a tunnel. "Now I am." "What's wrong?" She paused, and the silence on the other end of the line felt heavier than it should have. "I think someone is in the house," she said finally. I sat up immediately, sleep draining from my body like a wave receding. "Are you sure? Did you call the police?" "Not yet. It's just... I don't know if it's a person." Those words made my heart race faster. "What do you mean?" Another silence. "It's in the hallway now. Get out of there!" I nearly screamed. "Clara, get out of the house, now!" "I can't." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "If I run, I think it will follow me." I stood up, fumbling for my keys. "I'm coming. Stay on the phone with me, okay?" She didn't respond. "Clara? Are you still there?" All I heard was slow, labored breathing. I grabbed my coat and rushed out the door, my heart pounding with every step. Clara's house was only 15 minutes away, but with every passing second, the urgency grew, an unsettling sensation that gnawed at me. "Clara, tell me what's happening," I pleaded, my voice tight with fear. She finally spoke, but her voice was barely above a whisper, so faint that I could hardly make it out. It doesn't have a face. I saw it through the crack in the door. It's standing there, but it has no face." A chill ran through me as I fumbled to start the engine. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way." The drive felt like a blur, traffic lights I ignored, streets that passed by too quickly. When I arrived, the lights in the house were on, but the front door was locked. "Clara!" "I'm outside." "Open the door!" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I called again, louder this time. "Clara, let me in!" But the line went dead. I didn't waste a second. I forced the lock with a card I'd always carried with me, a trick Clara and I had learned when we were kids to sneak out without our mom noticing. Inside, the house was eerily silent. "Clara?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. The air felt cold, much colder than it should have been for a spring night. I ascended the stairs, each step creaking beneath my feet. The hallway was dark, except for the faint light spilling from Clara's room at the end of the corridor. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was perfectly made, as if no one had slept in it. The window was wide open, letting in a cold, biting breeze. "Clara?" I whispered, unsure why I was speaking so softly. "Where are you?" I glanced over at the desk. Her phone was resting on top of a notebook, the screen still showing the recent call, mine. Beside it, the notebook had something scribbled in pencil. "It's not a dream. It's here." Suddenly, the air around me shifted. A heavy, oppressive feeling descended upon the room, as if something, or someone, was watching me from behind. I slowly turned around, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway was empty, but the shadow at the far end, where the stairs began, seemed darker than it should have been. Then a sound. A sharp, dry thud from downstairs. I bolted toward the stairs, pausing at the top. And there it was, standing in the doorway. A figure, impossibly tall, its limbs stretched out in twisted angles, like it didn't belong in this world. It had no face, only a smooth, pale surface that reflected the dim light. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. Each step was heavy, each movement methodical. I backed away into Clara's room, slamming the door behind me. Frantically, I searched for something to block it, but the noise stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, worse than any sound. Seconds, maybe minutes, passed before I heard a whisper. "Clara isn't here," it hissed. My body froze. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fear. The whisper came again, this time directly on the other side of the door. "She invited me." The door groaned as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I couldn't wait to find out what it was. I rushed to the open window and looked down. It was a significant drop, but anything was better than facing whatever was behind that door. I jumped. The impact was brutal, but I managed to stay on my feet. Limping, I ran to my car, never daring to look back. I called the police from the road, but when they arrived they found nothing. No signs of struggle, no trace of an intruder, just an empty house, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew the truth. Clara's house was hiding something darker, something I couldn't fully understand, and I feared it was still waiting. My sister's phone is still on her desk. It's been weeks, and there is no trace of Clara. But sometimes, at night, I hear that whisper. She invited me, and I know something is still watching me. The next day, I spent all my time installing more security cameras, adding motion sensors, and replacing the locks with stronger bolts. I didn't care about the strange looks from the employee at the hardware store. That night, I checked every lock, tested every camera, and went to bed with a bat beside me and the lamp still on. Sleep came in short bursts. Every little sound woke me up, the heating system, branches scratching at the windows, the ice dropping from the machine. At 2:07 a.m., the laughter returned. This time, it came from the closet in my bedroom. It was more intense, with a tone almost hungry. The closet door was closed, but I saw something move beneath the crack. The door started to vibrate slightly. I grabbed the bat and rushed to the door, stumbling in my desperation. I ran down the stairs two at a time, the laughter following me, filling the air around me. I reached the kitchen, my hands trembling as I searched for my keys. The laughter stopped. In the silence, I heard heavy drops falling behind me, trip, trip, trip. I turned slowly. The floor was empty, except for a trail of dark, damp stains leading from the kitchen door to where I was standing. I touched one of the stains. It was warm and sticky. Then the laughter exploded beside my ear. I ran out of the house in my pajamas and drove to a 24-hour diner. I stayed there until dawn, calling my friend Mike, a contractor who had helped fix the house when I moved in. "I need your help," I told him. "Something's wrong in the house." At 3:47 a.m., something woke me up at my window. I know this because I checked my phone when the noise startled me. It wasn't any animal sound I had ever heard before. It wasn't a deer, a raccoon, or even a bear. The noise sounded again, a wet click, followed by something heavy dragging across the floor. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The silence of the rental cabin surrounded me. I had chosen this place specifically for its isolation, 2 miles from the nearest house, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. Perfect for a weekend of writing and clearing my mind after the divorce. Now, that isolation seemed like a mistake. The sound got closer to my window. Click, click, drag. My mouth went dry. I could hear breathing now, deep and rough, like a chest much larger than any local animal's was rising and falling with each inhale. I reached for the lantern on the nightstand, but my shaking hand knocked over an empty glass, which hit the floor with a dull thud. The breathing and clicks stopped immediately. I whispered, and the silence stretched, heavy and expectant. My own breath sounded too loud in my ears. After 30 seconds of stillness, I heard movement again. This time, the sound was moving toward the front of the cabin. The porch boards creaked under its weight. Whatever it was, it had to weigh at least as much as a full-grown adult. I stood up slowly, trying to avoid making the floorboards creak. The lantern felt slippery in my sweaty palm. I was only wearing a t-shirt, and I could feel the chill in the air creeping closer. The boxers and the fresh air made my skin crawl as I checked my phone. No signal. Of course, there wasn't any. That was the reason I had chosen this place. The sound of something moving on the porch continued, slow, deliberate steps, and finally, it stopped right in front of the main door. I heard that damp, clicking sound again, now closer, followed by what sounded like claws scraping against wood. I had two options: stay in the bedroom and hope it would go away, or try to figure out what was lurking outside. The rational part of my brain told me to stay still, but there was another part, the same one that made me pause to look at car accidents, or read about real-life crimes before bed, that needed to know. I carefully opened the bedroom door, holding my breath at the faint squeak of the hinges. The main room of the cabin was dark, except for a strip of moonlight filtering through the front windows. The scratching at the door had stopped. My bare feet made no sound as I moved forward. I could see the door now, a solid piece of oak with a small window at head height. The moonlight was bright enough to make out anything large moving clearly. I was about 10 feet from the door when a shadow passed in front of the window. My heart slammed against my ribs. The shadow was too tall, its proportions too wrong to be human. I silently reached for the flashlight but didn't turn it on, unsure if I really wanted to illuminate whatever was on the other side of that door. The doorknob began to turn. Not as if someone was trying to twist it, but more like something was exploring it, testing it. The movement stopped, and I heard that damp click again, right on the other side of the door, followed by what sounded like sniffing. Finally, my curiosity overtook my fear. I flipped on the flashlight and aimed it toward the window. Two eyes reflected the light back at me, but they were wrong. They were huge, the size of softball balls, glowing a sickly pale green like a cat's eyes in the headlights of a car. But these weren't cat eyes. They were too far apart, staring at me from at least 7 feet off the ground. I stumbled back, the beam of the flashlight shaking in my hand, and as I looked back through the window, the eyes were gone. But now I could hear movement on the porch, lots of movement, like something huge was pacing back and forth. The click sounded again, and this time, I saw what was causing it. A long, pale appendage, something between a human arm and a tentacle, slithered into view through the window. It was sickening, with joints in the wrong places. The click was coming from what seemed like hard plates or ridges running along its length. The appendage was exploring the window frame, testing it. My back slammed into the kitchen counter as I blindly reached behind me, not taking my eyes off the window. My hand found the handle of a knife in the dish rack. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The appendage withdrew from the window for a moment, and everything fell silent. Then, the entire door shook in its frame as something hit it from the outside. The force was enough to make me almost drop the lantern. The door held, but another impact made the hinges creak. Whatever it was trying to break in, and with the strength of those blows, the door wasn't going to hold much longer. I ran back to the bedroom, my feet pounding against the floor. I grabbed my phone and the car keys, threw on the first pair of pants I could find, and shoved my feet into boots. I rushed to the front door, struggling with the sticky window frame. Finally, I lifted it with a loud screech of old wood, and the cool night air hit my face. I poked my head out to look down. The bedroom window was about 6 feet off the ground, a hard but manageable fall. Behind me, I heard the main door give way with a creak that echoed through the cabin. Without a second thought, I launched myself out the window, tucking my shoulder the way I remembered from my high school football days. I landed on my feet, trying to catch my breath. I heard something heavy moving inside the cabin, furniture being shoved around, claws or heels scratching against the wood. I knew it had been there just moments before. I ran towards the rental car, parked about 30 meters away, barely visible under the moonlight. Behind me, I heard the creature moving swiftly through the cabin. The bedroom window frame splintered as something much larger than me forced its way through it. I frantically pressed the unlock button on my key fob, tapping it repeatedly. The car lights flickered, and I heard the click of the locks unlocking. "Come on, Jay," I muttered, only 10 meters away. A heavy thud sounded behind me, as if something large had landed on the floor. The sound of the click sped up now, almost frantic. I could hear it getting closer. 5 meters. I reached for the car door handle. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a pale figure rise. Something grabbed my ankle, one of those strange appendages, with joints in the wrong places, wrapped around my leg. Its rough surface felt like sandpaper. I was pulled to the ground, the keys flying from my hand. The creature began dragging me toward the darkness beyond the car. Kicking with my free leg, my boot connected with something. The pressure on my ankle loosened for a moment. I rolled onto my back, pulling the knife from my pocket under the moonlight. Finally, I could see clearly what had caught me. It was massive, at least 9 feet tall. Its pale body seemed to emit a faint glow in the dark. The main mass of its body was vaguely humanoid, but that was where the resemblance ended. 4 of those appendages flailed, their movements unnatural and grotesque. The serpent-like appendages extended from its torso, each at least 8 feet long, moving independently like snakes lying in wait. Its head was the worst part, too wide, without a true face to speak of, just those enormous green eyes and a mass of small tentacles where its mouth should have been. The tentacles twisted and writhed, and the clicking sound came from small, hard plates running along them. The creature pulled me toward it. I struggled and managed to make a slash with the knife, cutting one of its appendages. A clear liquid oozed from the wound, and the creature emitted a sharp, penetrating sound, a wail that made my teeth vibrate. It released me, and I staggered to my feet. The creature followed, its strange, unnatural movement covering ground quickly. The moonlight barely illuminated enough to prevent me from crashing into trees. Branches scratched at me as I ran, and the clicking sound continued, growing closer with each passing second. I lost track of time as I sprinted. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were about to collapse, but the sound behind me never stopped, always within 20 meters, as if it knew exactly how far it could let me get before closing the gap again. Occasionally, I felt the brush of air as one of its appendages passed dangerously close to my head. The terrain began to slope upward, and now I was running uphill, my legs protesting with each step. But then I remembered something from my morning walks. At the top of this hill, there was an old fire tower. If I could make it there, maybe I'd have a chance. The ground became rockier, making my progress more difficult. I was almost at the top when I tripped over an exposed root and fell hard. Before I could get up, something wrapped around my waist and lifted me off the ground. The creature had caught me. It turned me so that I was face to face with it. Those green eyes, as big as plates, stared into mine, and the tentacles around what should have been its mouth twisted with frantic speed. At this distance, the stench was unbearable, a mix of ozone and rotting vegetation. More appendages coiled around my arms and legs, pinning me in the air. My knife was still in my hand, but I couldn't move it enough to use it. It brought its head closer to mine, its tentacles extending as if trying to touch me. And then I heard it, a sound I had never been more grateful for in my life, the beating of a helicopter. At first, it was just a distant hum, but it quickly grew louder, turning into a roar. The creature turned its head toward the sound, its eyes shining brightly in the moonlight. The grip on my limbs loosened slightly, and a beam of light swept across the hilltop as the helicopter appeared overhead. The creature let out a deafening screech, its body writhing as it released me. I fell hard to the ground, rolling until I came to a stop as the helicopter's light focused directly on the creature. Then I saw it. It wasn't just one helicopter, but several. They weren't ordinary civilians. They were dressed in black, with protection suits, hanging from ropes, carrying weapons that emitted an electric buzzing sound. The creature tried to retreat towards the tree line, but it was already surrounded. The men in suits aimed their weapons, and blue and white energy beams shot towards the creature. Its body shook and twisted as the beams struck it. Those appendages of its flailed wildly, knocking down branches and scattering leaves. One of the men grabbed me by the arm and spun me around. He was fully covered in a protective suit, and his voice came out distorted through a speaker. "Mr. Peterson," he said. "I'm Agent Sargent from the Special Containment Department. We need you to come with us." I glanced at the creature, which was now on the ground. Its movements slowed as the men placed something that looked like a metallic net over it. "What is that?" I managed to ask, still trying to process what I had just witnessed. "Classified," Chen replied. "But this isn't the first time we've encountered one. Come on, we need to get it out of here." He led me towards one of the helicopters that had landed in a nearby clearing. "Are there more of them?" I asked, still looking back as the men secured the creature in some kind of container. Chen hesitated before answering. "Mr. Peterson," he said, "the best thing you can do is try to forget that any of this ever happened. Trust me." I climbed into the helicopter, still staggering, trying to process what was left of the creature. Chen handed me a stack of papers and a pen. "Start with the confidentiality agreement," he said. I looked at him, his eyes hidden behind the visor of his suit. "Mr. Peterson," he continued, his voice carrying an odd weight, "welcome to a much larger world than you ever thought existed." I signed the papers as the helicopter lifted off, leaving the cabin and the creature behind. But even as we flew away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still more of them out there, hidden in the remote corners of the world, waiting to be discovered. Or maybe, I thought, as I signed another page, they were waiting to find us. The first time I ever heard about the Whispering Forest was at a college party. Someone mentioned, between laughs, that it was the perfect place to test the courage of a skeptic. The legend said that if you entered the forest at midnight and stayed silent, you could hear voices. But they weren't human voices, they said. They were the voices of those who had entered and never left. I didn't believe any of that, of course. Urban legends, stories to scare tourists, that's all it was. But when my friend Mar suggested we go, not to debunk the myth, I couldn't resist the challenge. "It'll be fun," he said, flashing his usual self-assured smile. "If we hear something, at least we'll have a great story to tell." So there we were, at 11:45 p.m., standing at the entrance of the Whispering Forest, flashlights in hand and backpacks filled with snacks and beer, as if we were about to embark on a typical camping night. But the forest? It was much darker than I had anticipated. The trees loomed like silent giants, their branches interlacing to block out any trace of moonlight. The only source of light was our flashlights, which barely managed to cut through the thick darkness. Mark led the way, talking loudly about how ridiculous all of this was. I followed closely behind, trying to stay near. "Did you know there's an online article about this place?" he said, brushing aside some low-hanging branches. "Supposedly, it's some kind of nexus between worlds or something like that." "Pure nonsense." "What about the people who disappeared?" I asked, though I tried to sound casual. Mark laughed. "They probably got lost and never found their way back. It's a huge forest, you know? There's nothing supernatural about it." We reached a clearing around midnight. The air felt colder here, and a light breeze made the leaves whisper to one another. Mark turned off his flashlight and sat down on a fallen log. "All right, here we are. Now turn off the light and stay quiet. Let's see if anything strange happens." Reluctantly, I turned off my flashlight. The darkness was absolute, a complete void that made every sound feel amplified. I could hear my own breath, the beat of my heart, and something else, a whisper. "Did you hear that?" I asked in a low voice. Mark didn't answer. "Mark?" "Still nothing," I said, spinning around to look at him, but I couldn't see him. I turned my flashlight back on and pointed it toward the log where he had been sitting, empty. "Mark, this isn't funny." Then the whisper came again, louder this time. It wasn't exactly words, more like a sound I could barely comprehend, but it had a rhythm, a cadence that made my skin crawl. "Who's there?" I called out. The whisper turned into a murmur, like dozens of voices mixing together, their words clashing in a chaotic blend of meaning. I spun in circles, pointing my flashlight in every direction. The trees seemed closer now, like they had moved when I wasn't looking. And then I saw it. A tall, thin figure, almost blending in with the trunks of the trees, but its eyes shone with a faint blue glow, staring at me. Mark murmured, "You shouldn't have come." I could now make out some of the words. Panic flooded through me, and before I even realized it, I screamed and ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get out of that forest. The branches hit my face and arms as I plunged deeper into the darkness. The murmur didn't stop. No matter how fast I ran, the voices were there, whispering, singing, laughing. Finally, I tripped and fell. My flashlight rolled away from me, extinguishing as it hit the ground. In the darkness, I felt cold, long hands dragging across my skin. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The voices surrounded me, and for the first time, I understood clearly what they were saying. One more for the forest. When I woke up, I was at the entrance, exactly where we had started. It was daylight now, and my flashlight lay beside me, its battery completely drained. I didn't find Mark. I called the police, but after an extensive search, they found nothing. Now, every time I close my eyes, I hear the murmur. It's always there, always just on the edge of my understanding. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, I feel the forest calling to me, whispering for me to return. Mike arrived that afternoon and listened to my story without interrupting. We went over every corner of the house together, the attic, the ventilation ducts, the basement. We found nothing. It could have been raccoons in the walls, he suggested. They make strange noises. I didn't argue, but how could I explain the wet footprints or the breathing on my neck? Mike agreed to stay for a few days. We set up cots in the living room, safety in numbers. The first 2 nights were calm, but on the third, at 2:07 in the morning, the laughter woke us both. "What the hell is that?" Mike said, sitting up on his cot. The sound was coming from the kitchen. That wet, gurgling laugh seemed to mock the silence. "Do you hear it too?" I whispered. Mike nodded, pale. "It's raccoons," he said. We grabbed our phones and the baseball bat, making our way toward the kitchen. With every step, the sound grew louder. The motion sensor light didn't turn on. The kitchen was pitch dark. The laughter filled the air, bouncing off the walls, impossible to pinpoint. Mike tried to turn on the lights. Nothing. "No electricity," he murmured, his voice tight with tension. Our flashlights illuminated something moving near the ceiling, a shadow darker than the shadows themselves, slipping between the beams. The laughter stopped. In the silence, we heard something crawling above us, leaving a wet trail behind. A warm drop fell on my shoulder. "Run," Mike said. We bolted for the front door, the laughter growing louder and louder, following us. We jumped into his truck and sped off. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something standing at my door, twisted figure, its long arm raised in a farewell before it began laughing. I haven't returned to the house since that night. Mike called a priest, a paranormal investigator, and a woman who claimed to feel spirits. They all agreed that something was wrong with the house, but none could explain it. The next day, I put the house up for sale. There were no takers. The stories started spreading, strange noises, wet footprints, laughter at night. Sometimes I pass by the house during the day. From the outside, it looks normal. But at night, I've seen lights moving inside, even though there's no electricity. Once I heard that wet laugh in the air. Now I never slow down when I drive past at night. Sometimes I wake up at 2:07 in the morning, hearing echoes of that laughter in my mind. I keep a bat next to my bed, just in case. I never, ever laugh in the darkness. The previous owners should have never bought this house. That's what I keep telling myself over and over again while I sit in my room, my back pressed against the headboard of the bed, listening to heavy footsteps on the floor downstairs. They're moving through the kitchen. I know this because the old linoleum always creaks in that specific way, the same way it does when I walk around down there. But it's not me. I'm up here, clutching my phone, trying to decide if I should call the police again. The problem is, they've already come twice. Both times, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of any intruders. Just those damn muddy boot prints that keep showing up every morning. It all started 3 weeks ago, right after I closed the deal on the house. I got it at a steal, a foreclosure that needed repairs but had good bones. At least that's what my real estate agent said. The bones may have been good, but there's something else that's not right here. The first morning after I moved in, I found muddy boot prints on the front porch. Size 12 or 13, from the marks on the soles. They led directly to the front door and then vanished. At first, I thought maybe it was the previous owner, checking on the house out of habit. But when I asked around the neighborhood, I found out he had died 6 months ago, heart attack in the upstairs bathroom. I cleaned up the prints that morning. The mud was thick, a reddish-brown color like clay, but it hadn't rained in weeks, and the ground around the house was as dry as a desert. I checked the entire property. There were no similar prints anywhere else. No visible source for that kind of mud. The next morning, they were back. Same size, same mud, same pattern leading to the door. I cleaned them again. And again the next day. And the day after that. For 2 straight weeks, those prints showed up every morning. At night, I installed security cameras. Nothing showed up on the footage. The prints were just there in the morning, as if they had materialized out of thin air. I called the police the first time after reviewing the recordings. They came, took a report, and found nothing. I called them again 3 days later. Same result. The neighbors hadn't noticed anything unusual. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lives next door and has one of those doorbell cameras, didn't have any strange recordings either. I even spread flour on the porch one night, thinking I could catch more tracks or signs of tampering. In the morning, the prints were in the flour, but the rest of it was undisturbed, as if someone had just stepped down from the air. I started losing sleep. Any little noise would wake me up. I'd lie there in the dark, straining to hear something out of the ordinary, but there was never anything definitive, just the normal sounds of an old house settling. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Until tonight. I went to bed around 11 like always, double-checking all the doors and windows before I lay down. But something felt different. Something felt off. Maybe it was the silence, the way the house seemed to hold its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be different. That tonight, I might finally discover what was happening in this house. Something I couldn't explain away. With the windows shut and the security system activated, the cameras were working. I was on the verge of falling asleep when I heard it, a step unlike the others on the front porch. That hollow sound of a boot hitting the old wooden planks. My eyes snapped open, and I stayed completely still, barely breathing. I listened intently as another step echoed, then another. The footsteps crossed the porch slowly, deliberately. When they reached the door, I heard something that made my blood run cold, the sound of a key turning in the lock. But that was impossible. I had changed all the locks when I moved in. I had the only keys. The door opened, and the hinges didn't even creak. They never do. I oiled them last weekend. The footsteps entered my house. At that moment, I grabbed my phone and retreated to my bedroom. I wanted to run, to get out of the house, but the footsteps were already in the hallway, standing between me and the front door. The back door was locked too. I was trapped here. The steps were now in the living room, slow, methodical, as if searching for something, or someone. I checked my phone, no signal. Of course, there wasn't. It never gets a good reception in this house. One of the many things I planned to fix. The footsteps were climbing the stairs now. The first step creaked, as it always does, another thing on my to-do list. The second step, then the third. They were coming up. I pressed my back harder against the headboard, my heart pounding so loudly I could feel it in my throat. Fourth step, fifth step. The footsteps reached the landing, then stopped. I held my breath. In the dark, I saw a shadow move beneath the door. The doorknob began to turn. The knob turned all the way, and the door slowly creaked open. There was no one there. Darkness filled the hallway, but the footsteps were in my room now. I could hear them, the weight of each step echoing against the wooden floor as they slowly approached my bed. The mattress sank. I felt the springs compressing under the weight of something right at the edge of the bed. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it there. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands trembling as I gripped my phone, though it was useless. Then I heard the voice. "You bought my house." It was deep, raspy, as if it belonged to someone who had smoked their whole life. I opened my eyes. No one was there, but the weight was still pressing down on the mattress, and the voice echoed again, this time much closer. "Your house," it murmured. "I died here." My heart couldn't take it anymore. It gave out, just like the old shower I'd been fixing when I accepted the job as the night watchman at the local history museum. I didn't expect much more than hours of boredom. The pay was decent, the nights were quiet, and the exhibits seemed harmless enough: fossils, ancient tools, dusty documents, and a few mounted animal skeletons. It was a small place, not the kind of museum that would attract large crowds or fame. Everything started during my third week, on a particularly cold and silent night. The building's heating was old and unreliable, so I kept a thermos of coffee and a thick jacket to stay warm while I did my rounds. The museum was divided into three main sections: the Paleontology Hall, the Colonial History Gallery, and the exhibition of ancient cultures always began with paleontology. There was something strangely comforting about dinosaur bones. They were impressive yet inert, impossible to misinterpret. That night, as I walked through the gallery, I noticed something out of place. One of the display cases, the one containing an ammonite fossil, had its door slightly ajar. I frowned. I had checked all the cases at the beginning of my shift. I carefully closed the door and reassured myself. "Check it again." As I headed towards the Colonial Gallery, a chill ran down my spine. I tried to attribute it to the cold, but then I heard a noise, a faint creak. I stopped, holding my flashlight high, scanning the room. The shadows of the mannequins dressed in 18th century clothing seemed unusually elongated under the dim glow of the emergency lights. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing in the empty space. Nothing. I continued on to the Ancient Cultures exhibit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. This section always made me a bit nervous. It contained a collection of indigenous artifacts, ceremonial masks, ritual tools, and a carved wooden figure that made me feel watched every time I passed by. The label called it the Guardian of the Shadows. That night, as I passed by the figure, I swore its position had changed. Its arm, which was usually pointing downward, seemed to be slightly raised. I directed my flashlight directly onto the carving. It was dark wood, intricately carved with details that made it appear to have living eyes and sharp teeth. "You're just tired," I whispered to myself, even though my heart was racing. I continued my rounds, but the sounds began to multiply: creaks of wood, faint whispers, like leaves being moved by the wind. I decided to check the security cameras. Maybe a mouse had gotten in, or some structural issue was causing those noises. When I reached the control room, I reviewed the footage from the last few hours. Everything seemed normal until I reached the footage from the ancient cultures exhibit. The figure of the guardian of the shadows moved. It wasn't a subtle movement. In the video, I saw it slowly turn its head toward the camera, as if it knew it was being watched. I rewound the video and watched it again. Each time I saw it, the movement seemed more obvious, more deliberate. My mind searched for a logical explanation, some kind of equipment failure, maybe a prank by the staff earlier in the day. But I couldn't ignore the cold sweat running down my back. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud coming from the gallery. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the source of the noise. The door to the colonial gallery was wide open. Inside, the mannequins were all disarrayed, some lying on the floor. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the darkness. My flashlight trembled as I tried to catch my breath. Then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, unmistakable. "You don't belong here." The sound was coming from the ancient cultures exhibit. My feet seemed to move on their own as I walked toward the guardian's figure. There it was, on its pedestal, with its arm fully raised, now pointing directly at me. The emergency lights flickered. In an instant, I realized I wasn't alone. The ceremonial masks, the ritual tools, even the carved figures seemed to move ever so slightly. Their shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally. I ran, rushing past the main door, not stopping until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life. My hands were trembling so violently that I could barely turn the key in the ignition. I called the museum director the next morning, coming up with an excuse to avoid going back. Since then, I've been investigating the Guardian of the Shadows. There are only a few references, but they all agree on one thing: this figure is not meant to be observed by the curious. It's a guardian, but not of the living. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed any longer that night, and I don't want to find out. The museum is still open, but every time I pass by I speed up, because even from a distance, I can feel that figure's eyes on me, waiting for me to return. A low laugh filled the room. My mind raced, recalling the sale documents. The previous owner, Harold Mitchell, had passed away in the house 6 months ago. His children sold it to the bank, and the bank sold it to me. "Mr. Mitel?" I asked in a barely audible voice. A soft growl of approval responded. "Call me Harry. That's what everyone called me." The mattress sank deeper, as if it had shifted. "Why? Why are you here?" "This is my home," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I spent my whole life fixing it up, improving it. I never finished everything I wanted to do. There was always something more." The voice paused for a moment, as if reflecting. "There are still things that need attention." My hands continued to tremble, but my fear was slowly being replaced by a strange curiosity. "The boot prints. Was it you?" I whispered. Another laugh. "Of course," the voice responded. "I wanted to make sure you were taking care of the place." The mattress creaked again as the weight shifted. "You're doing well," the voice continued, now closer to the door. "Grease those hinges. Good job. But the shower still leaks, you know." I heard it walking toward the door, slow but deliberate footsteps. "Are you going to hurt me?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I would have liked. "Why would I do that?" the voice responded in a mocking tone. "You seem like a good guy. You're taking care of my house. That's all I ever wanted." The footsteps stopped at the threshold of the door. "I'll stop bothering you with the footprints. I'm tired of that anyway. But I'll be nearby watching." The steps descended down the hallway, down the stairs, and crossed the living room. The front door opened and closed with a soft click. Then silence. I stayed frozen for hours, waiting for dawn. When the first rays of light finally filled my room, I forced myself out of bed. My legs were shaking, but I pushed myself down the stairs. There were boot prints on the floor, large, size 12 or 13, made of reddish clay. They started at the front door, crossed the house, went upstairs, entered my room, and then retraced the same path. I followed them to the basement door. Something compelled me to open it. The basement was cold, and it was dark, but I felt like I had to check. I walked over to the oven and took out the filter, which was completely black with dust and completely clogged. I changed it right there and then, and when I went back upstairs, the footprints had disappeared. That was 2 months ago, and since then, I haven't seen any more footprints. But sometimes, when I'm working around the house, I hear a low grunt of approval or a suggestion, like when I'm about to cut a pipe without turning off the shut-off valve. A gruff voice would growl, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." I've stopped being afraid now. When I hear those heavy footsteps at night, I just smile and say, "Good night, Harry." Sometimes he responds, sometimes not, but I know he's there, making sure his house is in good hands. I still haven't fixed that leaky showerhead, but I will. After all, I have a very persistent ghost inspector. Story 18. The Whisper in the Creek. I shouldn't have gone back to that creek. I know that now, but at the time, something pushed me to return. A morbid curiosity, or perhaps a need to understand what had happened there. Now, I wish I hadn't. It all started 3 weeks ago, during what should have been a routine hike with my friends Mike and Sarah. The usual route, the Lancaster Trail, hidden deep in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. A well-kept secret, far from tourists. The morning had started perfectly. We parked Mike's Subaru at the trailhead at 7 a.m. The air was crisp, the kind of chill you get early in the day. Sarah handed us her usual mix of trail mix, loaded with M&Ms, while Mike checked our gear. We hiked for about 2 hours when I heard it, a strange, almost inaudible sound, like a whisper, just slightly louder than the wind rustling through the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks. "What's up, Dan?" Mike asked, adjusting his backpack. "Can't you hear it?" I replied, turning toward the woods. Both of them fell silent. The sounds of the forest continued as usual, leaves crunching under our boots, a woodpecker in the distance. "Listen," Sarah said, raising an eyebrow. I raised my hand, signaling for silence. There it was again, a soft whisper, but rhythmic, as if someone was speaking in low tones, too far away to make out the words. "Is someone down there?" I said, pointing toward the creek where I could hear the water running. Mike shook his head. "We're miles from any trail, Dan. No one comes out here." But I had heard something. "I'm going to take a look," I said, stepping off the trail. "Dan, seriously?" Mike sighed. "We've got a couple of miles left to the campsite. Just 5 minutes. Let me check." The slope down to the creek was steep, covered in wet leaves that made it slippery under my boots. I grabbed onto branches to keep from falling. As I descended, the whispers became clearer with every step. Now I could make out that they were voices, several of them, speaking quickly, but I still couldn't understand what they were saying. The creek appeared between the trees, a narrow current flowing over rocks covered in moss. "Hello?" I called. The whispering stopped immediately. I looked around, scanning the area. There was no one in sight. No signs of a camp, no footprints in the mud by the water, nothing. "Dan?" Mike yelled from above. "Is everything okay down there?" "Yeah," I replied, still searching. But the whispers didn't return. I made my way back to the trail, and that was when I realized I should have never gone down there. And even though I tried to keep walking, I couldn't get that sound out of my head that night. I almost mentioned it, but then I imagined the incredulous looks from Sarah and Mike's practical comments, so I stayed silent, letting Mike's bear stories fill the silence around the campfire. I should have left it all there, but I didn't. 3 days later, I was still thinking about that stream at work. My eyes blurred over the reports as the whispers repeated in my mind. I started Googling everything I could about the Lancaster Trail. At first, I didn't find anything unusual, but then an old forum caught my attention. One user had reported hearing voices in the forest near a stream, with no details, but just enough to send a chill down my spine. That night, I dove deeper into my search. I found an article from 1978 about a missing hiker in the area, Daniel Morrison. Rescue teams had searched near the Lancaster Trail but couldn't find him. Something inside me sparked. I called in sick to work, grabbed my lantern, voice recorder, and map, and returned to the trail. The forest felt different now. Every crackling branch made me jump. I reached the stream around noon and switched on the recorder. I stood by the water, listening to nothing. "Hello?" I called. The whisper returned again, quick, indistinct voices. This time, they were clearer and definitely coming from the other side of the stream. I crossed carefully, my lantern focusing on an opening in the rocks hidden behind ferns. It was a cave. I crouched to enter, my lantern revealing smooth walls, too perfect to be natural. The air felt thick, and the whisper echoed all around, impossible to pin down. The tunnel curved into a small chamber with several exits in the floor. Something caught the light under my lantern. It was an old, dusty camera, but it was intact. My hand trembled as I picked it up. The whispers were louder now, the words almost understandable. Then my lantern flickered and went out. The darkness was complete. The whispers surrounded me, and they said my name. I ran. I don't know how I found the exit. My memory is a blur until I saw the light of day again, gasping for breath, covered in mud. That night, from the safety of my apartment in Boston, I looked up more about Daniel Morrison. He had disappeared with a camera. I haven't gone back to the Lancaster Trail, but sometimes, in my dreams, I hear the whispers. They're clearer now. A few days ago, I received a letter with no return address. Inside, there was a damaged, water-stained old photo. In one corner, you could clearly see the entrance to the cave, hidden behind the ferns. I burned the photo. I'm moving soon, far away from mountains and forests. But I know it doesn't matter where I go. The whispers know my name. They were getting stronger. The first time I heard the knocks, it was 2:47 in the morning. I lived alone in a small apartment on the 10th floor of an old brick building in the heart of the city. It was a quiet place, maybe too quiet for someone like me who was used to the constant hum of the urban noise. That night, the silence felt so thick, so dense, that it seemed to swallow any sound that dared to break through. It was almost suffocating, until the knocks came. Knock, knock, knock. They came from my front door, 3 slow, firm knocks that seemed to echo through the emptiness. I put down the book I was reading and froze, waiting for the knocks to repeat. But nothing. My heart began to race. I stood there, still as stone, listening, but there was no sound. Tentatively, I walked over to the door, barefoot, feeling the cold hardwood against my skin. My pulse was quick, my breath shallow, as I peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, lit only by the flickering fluorescent lights above. They blinked sporadically, casting strange shadows. I opened the door just enough to peek my head out. "Hello?" My voice echoed softly in the hall, but no response came. I waited a few moments. Still nothing. I closed the door and locked it twice, telling myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. The following night, at the same time, the knocks returned. Knock, knock, knock. This time, I jumped out of bed quicker, determined to catch the prankster who thought they could scare me. But when I looked through the peephole again, the hallway was empty. I yanked the door open, ready to confront whoever was messing with me. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and desolate. A strange chill ran down my spine. There was no one. The air felt thick with tension. I slammed the door shut, ensuring all the locks were secure. When I returned to my bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, even though the apartment was completely empty. On the third day, I decided to speak with the building manager. I asked him if anyone had been hanging around the halls late at night. He didn't answer at first, just lifting his eyes from a yellowed newspaper. But it wouldn't be the first time someone mentioned strange things happening on this floor. He finally muttered. That caught my attention. What kind of strange things? I asked. He shrugged, his expression unreadable. Knocks on doors, whispers in the hallways, flickering lights. This building's old, it's got its stories. Stories. The word lingered in my mind the rest of the day, its meaning heavy in the air. That night, I decided to stay awake. I sat on the couch, the lights off, staring at the door. My clock read 2:46 when I suddenly felt it, the air shifting, thickening. It was hard to describe, but the atmosphere turned heavy, as if something invisible was filling the space, pressing down on me. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was louder this time, much louder than before. It rattled the door. My hands gripped the baseball bat I'd brought with me, my knuckles turning white. Who's there? I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer, but the knocks kept coming. This time, they were faster, more insistent. Knock, 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 knock. I jumped up, the bat raised in my hands, and threw open the door. The hallway was empty, but something felt off. The air was freezing, so cold that my breath formed clouds in front of me. The lights flickered again, casting unsettling shadows. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the hallway. Barely visible, like a shadow that didn't belong to any object. It didn't move, but I could feel its attention on me, piercing through the distance. What do you want? I called out, my voice rising, more desperate than I intended. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it faded like it had been erased from existence with the flicker of the lights. I slammed the door shut, stumbling backward into the living room, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. It was a night like no other, completely out of control. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with thoughts, and the morning brought no relief. The next day, I took to the internet, searching for anything that could explain what I had seen. I stumbled upon an old news story from 30 years ago about the building. According to the report, a man had died on the 10th floor. The cause of death was said to be an accident, a fall down the stairs while carrying a heavy box. But the neighbors told a different story. They talked about hearing loud knocks on the doors. I found a comment on a forum, someone sharing their experience and asking for help, but it never came. Since then, the 10th floor has become infamous, known for its eerie stories. People speak of hearing knocks in the night, feeling like they're being watched, and some even claim to have seen a dark figure lurking in the hallway. That night, I decided I wouldn't wait around for the knocks to come. I stayed in the living room, with the lights on and a bat by my side, ready for anything. But nothing happened. When I finally dared to sleep, I had a dream. In it, I was standing in front of my door, and from the other side, someone whispered my name. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat. It was 2:47 in the morning. The room was completely silent, but there was something new on the door, 3 long, deep scratches, like claws had torn into the wood. The next day, I packed up my things. When the building manager saw me leaving, he simply nodded, almost as if he had been expecting it. Now, I live in a new building. One with no history, no shadows in the hallways. But every night at 2:47, I wake up, expecting to hear those knocks. Sometimes, I swear I can still hear them, echoing somewhere deep in the corners of my memory. Or maybe, just maybe, it's much closer than I think. 3 days after moving in, the first message appeared. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed it, forming in the fogged-up mirror. Get out of here while you can. The letters were reversed, as if someone had written them from the other side. My hand trembled as I wiped them away with the towel. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of my imagination. Too much stress from the move. The apartment was modest, but cheap, in a central area. The Craigslist ad had mentioned 2 roommates, though I had never seen them. I would hear their movements at night, footsteps in the hallway, doors closing, distant murmurs, but we never crossed paths. The second message appeared that very same night. After a shower, the steam from the hot water revealed it on the mirror. Don't sleep too deeply. Look behind the walls. They're always watching. I hurried to wipe it off, but the fear had already set in. I began photographing the messages, documenting them in a notebook, even searching for patterns in the words. During the first week, they appeared twice a day, always with warnings: don't sleep too deeply. Look behind the walls. They always watch. I installed a camera in the bathroom, pointing at the mirror. I reviewed the footage carefully, but the messages just appeared, letter by letter, seemingly written by invisible hands. The house had always had a strange atmosphere, like the air was thicker than usual. But when my wife and I first moved in, we chalked it up to the years of abandonment. The property had been empty for at least a decade before we bought it. It was a rare opportunity, an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields. The woods, the perfect escape from the urban hustle. At first, everything seemed fine. We spent our first few months cleaning, repairing, and adjusting to rural life. But little by little, things started happening. Small details, objects that weren't where we had left them, doors we'd remembered closing that we found wide open, strange sounds at night, creaks, soft footsteps, murmurs. We tried to ignore it. "It's an old house," my wife Sarah would say, although her tone lacked conviction. One night, while working in the attic, I found something unexpected. In a dark corner, behind a pile of dusty furniture, there was a chest locked with an old, rusty padlock. It seemed ancient, with carvings on the wood I didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of caution, and I brought the chest down to the workshop, prying open the lock with a crowbar. Inside, there was a collection of seemingly random objects: a yellowed white dress, a book with no title and blank pages, and a small music box. When I opened the box, a strange, discordant melody played, the notes slightly off-key, as if they were out of place. I didn't recognize it, but instantly I felt a chill. Sarah joined me as I examined the objects. When she saw the dress, her expression changed. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "It was in the attic." "Why?" She shook her head. "It's the same as the one worn by the girl in the painting." The girl in the painting was an oil portrait hanging in the main hallway, a very old painting that had come with the house. It depicted a young woman with dark hair and sad eyes, dressed in a white gown almost identical to the one Sarah was holding. That night, as we lay in bed, we heard the music from the box playing by itself. I went down to the workshop, but there was no one there. The box was open, the little dancer slowly spinning to the rhythm of that unsettling melody. I slammed it shut and returned to the bedroom, trying not to wake Sarah. From that night on, things got worse. We began to hear footsteps throughout the house, especially at night. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone were exploring every corner. The lights flickered, and the air turned cold at random moments. But the worst happened one night when Sarah woke me up. "There's someone in the hallway," she whispered. I immediately jumped up, grabbing the wooden bed I had left next to the bed. I went into the hallway, expecting to find an intruder, but there was no one. I returned to the bedroom, trying to calm her, but her face was pale. "It wasn't an intruder," she said. "You saw the girl from the painting." My hands froze instantly. "That's impossible," I replied. Sarah simply shook her head. That same week, the portrait disappeared. It wasn't in the hallway or anywhere else in the house. It was as if it had never existed. Finally, we decided we couldn't stay there any longer. We contacted a local paranormal investigator, more as a desperate last resort than out of genuine belief. The man, an elderly gentleman named Edward, arrived with a suitcase full of equipment and a notebook. As he walked through the house, his expression grew darker. "This house holds a lot of pain," he said. He told us about the family that had lived there before us. A young girl had tragically drowned in a nearby lake while wearing a white dress. The family never recovered from the loss, and the house remained empty after her departure. "Sometimes spirits cannot leave," he explained, "especially when there are things that tie them to this world." He looked directly at me. "Did you find something here that shouldn't be?" he asked. I told him about the trunk, the dress, and the music box. Edward nodded slowly. "You need to return everything to where it belongs." That very night, we took the trunk to the lake. The full moon illuminated the water, which was still, like a mirror. When we placed it on the shore, the air shifted. The wind blew fiercely, and for a moment I thought I heard a whisper. When we returned home, the atmosphere had changed. The house was calm, the air lighter, as if an invisible weight had vanished. We moved out shortly after. We couldn't continue living there after everything that had happened, but sometimes, when I pass by the old farm, I look toward the lake and swear I see a figure dressed in white, watching from the shore. The following days were peaceful, too peaceful, like something was holding its breath, waiting. Jenny began taking sleeping pills, hoping to avoid the dreams, but I could tell they weren't fully working. She would toss and turn, murmuring things in her sleep, her face tense even while resting. I decided to install a motion-sensing camera at the foot of our bed. The first 2 nights, it didn't record anything, but on the third night, exactly at 3:47 a.m., the camera's infrared light activated, detecting motion. The video showed the blankets moving on their own, rising and falling, as if someone were breathing beneath them. The temperature reading in the corner of the frame dropped from 72 degrees Fahrenheit to 45 degrees Fahrenheit in under a minute. I didn't show the video to Jenny. She was already having a hard time, and I didn't want to make it worse, but I was having trouble sleeping, and I needed answers. So, I started researching. I read everything I could find about sleep paralysis, shared dreams, and supernatural encounters. Most of it wasn't very helpful, just accounts of people trying to explain their fears. But one testimony caught my attention. A woman in Oregon described something nearly identical to what we were experiencing. She said it all began after her mother's death. The presence would sit on her bed every night at the same time. It never hurt her, but it seemed to be waiting for something. Eventually, she got rid of it by blessing her house with the help of a local priest. I'm not religious, but I was desperate enough to try anything. I called several churches in our area until I found an elderly priest willing to listen. Father Martinez came to our house the next day. He walked through every room slowly, spraying holy water. And while reciting prayers in Latin, when she reached our bedroom, she stopped at the foot of the bed. Her hands were trembling as she made the sign of the cross. "There's something here," she whispered. "Something old, but not evil. It's just lost." She explained that sometimes spirits can get confused, especially if they had a strong connection to a place or a person during their life. That night, Jenny had another dream, but this time, as she spoke in her sleep, her voice was calm. "It's okay," she said. "I understand now. You can go home." The temperature dropped again, but not as drastically as before. I felt a breeze pass through the room, as though someone had quickly walked by me. Then, Jenny sighed in her sleep and turned over, calm for the first time in weeks. After that night, we never felt the presence again. 3 days have passed since I brought the box to the hotel. I still haven't opened it, but I can't stop staring at it. I bought some pruning shears this morning. They're sitting next to the box, waiting. Every time I reach out to grab them, I hear my Aunt Clara's voice. "Some doors should never be opened." but I keep thinking about my name carved into that beam. When did I write it? Why can't I remember? What else don't I remember? The lock feels cold under my fingers, as if it's been accumulating decades of secrets, waiting for someone to release them. Maybe that someone is me. Maybe it has to be. I take the shears in my hand. Their weight is reassuring, solid, real. Whatever is in this box, I tell myself, it's just paper, old photographs, letters, or documents, nothing that can harm me now. The lock breaks with a sharp snap. Inside, I find a stack of notebooks, the journals of my grandfather, dated between 1946 and 1981. The handwriting starts off neat but becomes more erratic as the years pass. There are newspaper clippings about missing people, more photographs, these ones without marks, and at the bottom of the pile, an envelope addressed to me, written in my grandmother's handwriting. The letter inside is brief. Dear David, if you're reading this, you've found your way back to the barn. I'm sorry. I tried to protect you from the truth, but maybe that was a mistake. Your grandfather wasn't evil. The war changed him. It broke something inside him that couldn't be fixed. The barn amplified what was broken. It made him see things that weren't there. It made him do things he would never have done otherwise. You were so young when it started affecting you too, the nightmares, the sleepwalking, finding yourself in the barn carving names you didn't remember carving. That's when your father and I knew we had to get you away. The barn feeds on darkness, David. Not evil, but the darkness we all carry inside, the regrets, the anger, the fear. It takes them and twists them, makes them grow until they're no longer yours. I should have burned it years ago, but I couldn't, because a small part of me still hoped that your grandfather might return to us, that what the barn took from him might be given back. I was wrong. Burn it all, David. The barn, the photographs, these journals, burn it all. Don't look back. Don't let them take away from you what they took from us with love. Grandmamma, I left the letter with trembling hands. From the hotel window, I could see the distant silhouette of the barn against the setting sun. Even from here, it seemed to watch me, waiting. My phone rang, making me jump. It was Aunt Clara again. Did you open it? She asked directly. I sighed deeply. Yes. Then you know what you have to do. I looked at the scattered journals on the hotel bed. So many secrets, so many answers. But Grandma was right. Some answers aren't worth the cost. I'll take care of it tonight, I told Clara. Be careful, she responded. That place doesn't let things go easily. I hung up and started gathering the journals and photographs. The sun was almost gone, painting the sky a blood-red color. In a few hours, it would be dark enough. I have the gasoline in my car. I bought it this morning, along with the cans. 5 gallons should be enough, more than enough. The barn can keep its darkness tonight. I'll give it back to the light. But first, I need to make one last trip inside. One last climb into the hay loft. I need to find my name among all those engravings and do what I should have done 25 years ago. Cut it. Erase any trace that we were ever there, that any of us were ever there. Some chains need to be broken, some curses need to end. I checked my pocket to make sure the matchbox was there. It was. In a few hours, that barn will be nothing but memories and smoke. But for now, I sit in my hotel room, watching the sun sink behind it, watching the shadows gather in its broken windows. I wonder if somewhere among those twisted beams and rotting wood, my grandfather's darkness still waits. Night is falling. It's almost time. I stand up and gather my things: flashlight, knife, gasoline, matches. The barn has taken enough from my family. Tonight I will reclaim something: peace, closure, a new beginning. The sun disappears below the horizon. Darkness falls. I grab my car keys. It's time to finish this. Meanwhile, the sounds from my roommates had become more frequent. Footsteps at odd hours, noises in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, things in my room moved around. My laptop slightly displaced, my shoes lined up differently, my coffee mug on the other side of the table. I tried leaving notes under their doors. Hi, it would be great to get to know each other. They never replied. I knocked on their doors at reasonable hours. No one answered. As the weeks went by, the messages in the mirror grew more urgent. Check the vents, listen to the scratching, count the shadows that move at night. One night, I woke up to find all the kitchen cabinets open. The refrigerator was slightly ajar, casting a cold light over the linoleum. I knew I hadn't left them that way. My paranoia grew. I took pictures of every corner of the apartment before I left for work, and compared everything when I returned. There was always something different. The couch cushions, the dishes in the drying rack, the magazines on the coffee table. Nights were worse. I heard murmurs in the vents, footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing. I took refuge in my room, with the door shut tight. I had locked myself in, sitting on a chair, blocking the doorknob, sleeping with a powerful flashlight by my side. Every little noise would make me jump. Then, a new message appeared. Look behind the mirror. I couldn't ignore it. One night, I waited until the house was completely silent. I grabbed my tools and disassembled the mirror. Behind it, there was a rectangular hole, almost a meter high. My flashlight illuminated a narrow passageway that seemed to stretch far beyond what the building's design should allow. The walls were covered in carved words, thousands of letters, all backwards, tangled up with each other. Some of them seemed freshly engraved. I heard something moving in the tunnel, a quick dragging sound, like fingernails scraping across the floor. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I hastily reassembled the mirror as quickly as I could and spent the night sleeping in my car. The next message was clear. Now you know where we live. I began to plan my escape. I found a small studio on the other side of the city that I could afford if I paid 2 months of rent in advance. I rented a van to move my things in one trip, but the night before I was supposed to move, everything changed. While I was packing, I heard doors opening and closing in the hallway, multiple footsteps, approaching from both directions. My room was silent, until I heard the door handle slowly start to turn. I didn't wait for it to open. I climbed out the window, descended the fire escape, and ran to my car. From the rearview mirror, I saw the shadows in my window. They were faces, but not quite human, misty, distorted, as though made of smoke and reflections. I hired movers to collect my belongings. I paid them extra so they wouldn't ask any questions. I moved into the studio and tried to forget. For a week, everything was calm. But one morning, while I was brushing my teeth, I noticed that the steam on the mirror was starting to form letters. Welcome home. The next day, I broke the lease and moved in with a friend in Portland. I sleep on his couch now. The mirrors are clean, the walls don't whisper, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I think I hear a faint scratching sound from the vents. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but I always clean the mirror before the words can form. I don't want to know if they followed me here. It was 2:47 a.m. when something strange happened to me on Route 23. I know because I checked my phone just before everything began. I was returning home after a night shift at the factory. That lonely road, flanked by cornfields, had always been quiet, but tonight, something felt off. At first, it was the cold. The temperature dropped quickly inside my truck. The digital display went from 45 degrees Fahrenheit to 38 degrees, then 35 degrees, and finally 32 degrees in just a few seconds. My breath became vapor right in front of me, even though the heat was on. Then I saw it. Something moved in the corner of my eye, running parallel to the road at 50 miles per hour. But the figure kept pace with me easily. I turned on the high beams and glanced to the side. What I saw made no sense. It was a tall figure, maybe 7 feet, thin as a stick. Its skin, if you could even call it that, was a dull gray, like wet clay. It had no face, just a smooth surface where eyes should be. Her legs were far too long, bending in impossible ways, and her arms didn't swing like those of a human. Instead, they dragged behind her body, like ribbons floating in the wind. I accelerated to 50, then 70, and finally 80 miles per hour. The creature was still there, keeping pace. But when I hit 85, it started to fall behind. Yet, it did something I'll never forget. Its head, featureless, swiveled toward me. Not the body, just the head. It turned a full 180 degrees while still moving forward. Then, without losing any speed, it changed direction. It veered off toward the forest, beside the road, and vanished. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching as black marks were left on the asphalt. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe I needed to convince myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But there they were, marks on the road, right where the creature had turned. They weren't regular footprints. They were deep ovals, about 18 inches long, as though something heavy had pressed down on the asphalt. I stepped out of the truck, flashlight in hand, my heart racing 1,000 beats per minute. I touched one of the marks. It was cold. Cold like ice in the dead of winter, much colder than the night air. I followed the marks into the woods. There was something unnerving about how perfectly they aligned. They formed a straight line, ignoring trees and rocks, as if nothing could stop the creature's path. I turned on my phone's camera and began recording. I walked slowly, following the marks. With every step, I felt a chill creep up my spine. Then I heard it. A sound from the forest, like something dragging itself through the leaves. It wasn't footsteps, it was something heavy, sliding quickly. I ran back to my truck, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. When I finally managed to start the engine, I looked in the rearview mirror. There, between the trees, was something. A tall, thin shadow that seemed to be watching me. I pressed the accelerator to the floor and didn't stop until I was home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I scrolled through the images and videos on my phone. In one of the clips, in a single frame, I saw something, an elongated, blurry figure between the trees. The next morning, I called the police and told them about the marks on the road. But they didn't find anything unusual. However, they told me something that froze my blood. It wasn't the first time someone had reported something strange on that stretch of road. I spent the next few days investigating. I found threads on forums and old posts about the shadow on Route 23. Missing persons, abandoned cars, sightings of impossible figures running alongside vehicles. Every story had one thing in common: the temperature always dropped before something happened. Now, every time I drive at night, my mind drifts back to that creature. Sometimes, I think I see something out of the corner of my eye. Other times, I feel the temperature inside my truck drop inexplicably, though only for a moment. I'm afraid of going back to Route 23. But something inside me tells me that no matter where I go, that thing has already found me. And perhaps, just perhaps, I'm waiting for the right moment to reappear. I won't stop again. It all started with what seemed to be an ordinary trip to the mountains with my friends Mike and Sarah. We were looking to disconnect, enjoy the fresh air, and escape the hustle and bustle of Boston. The trail we took, the Lancaster Trail in the White Mountains, was our favorite, a hidden gem, far from the tourists. The first day passed without incident. We started early, had a light meal, and ventured into the forest. But just a few hours into the journey, everything changed. "Did you hear that?" I asked, stopping dead in my tracks. Mike and Sarah exchanged glances. "What?" Mike responded. There was silence for a moment. All we could hear were the leaves crunching under our feet and the distant call of a woodpecker. But there, on the edge of my perception, a whisper. "There's someone down there," I said, pointing to the creek running parallel to the trail. Sarah shook her head. "It's probably just the water. The sound distorts here." But I knew it wasn't water. The sound formed words, though I couldn't understand them. They were too human to be a mere acoustic trick. I decided to investigate. Just 5 minutes, I told them as I descended toward the creek. The terrain was steep and slippery, covered in wet leaves. The whispers grew louder as I got closer to the water, but when I reached the creek, there was no one there, only the constant flow of water and the still trees. "Everything okay?" Sarah shouted from above. "Yeah, just 1 more minute," I lied. Down there, everything felt different. Colder, heavier. I listened again, but the whispers had stopped. Eventually, I made my way back to the trail. Sarah looked at me, a mix of concern and exasperation on her face. "Come on, Dan, we've got a lot of walking to do." Mike put a hand on my shoulder. "It was probably just your imagination. These things happen in the woods." I wanted to believe him. That night, we camped on a small hill, built a fire, shared stories, and tried to ignore the growing cold. But even with the conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about the whispers. Later, while Sarah and Mike slept in their tent, I got up to gather firewood. The forest was completely silent. Suddenly, the whispers returned, clearer, more urgent. I stood still, trying to discern them. It was as if multiple voices were speaking in unison, dragging out their syllables. Then, something cracked behind me. I turned around, my heart in my throat, but saw nothing. I ran back to camp, my flashlight swinging in all directions. Back in Boston, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had heard. I spent hours searching for information about the area, reading old forums and newspapers. I uncovered stories of missing hikers, rumors of voices in the woods, and a mysterious tunnel near a creek. One testimony, dated 1978, mentioned something that sent chills down my spine. "I heard voices near the water. I tried to follow them, but I never found anyone. That night, I dreamt of a dark tunnel and a shadow watching me. This couldn't be a coincidence." The following Friday, I went back alone to Lancaster Trail, armed with a detailed map, a voice recorder, and a powerful flashlight. I decided to explore beyond the creek. The path was more difficult without my friends. I reached the spot where I had first heard the whispers. And that's when I realized something was waiting for me. I descended, and the whispers were there, waiting for me. I walked, following the eerie sound, until something caught my eye between the rocks. A narrow opening, barely visible, hidden between the moss and branches. It looked like an entrance to a cave. I crouched down and flicked on my flashlight. The air that poured out of the opening was cold, damp, and had a strong earthy smell. The whispers grew louder. "This is a bad idea," I thought, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. The inside of the cave was much larger than it appeared from the entrance. The walls were covered with strange marks, symbols that resembled words written in a language I didn't recognize. The floor was damp, and my boots sank slightly into the mud. As I moved deeper, my flashlight revealed a passage that stretched further than my eyes could see. The whispers enveloped me now, more distinct, clearer. I could hear my name mixed in with other incomprehensible words. Suddenly, I felt something move behind me. I quickly swung the light around, but there was nothing there. I took a few more steps, and then my foot hit something hard. I looked down, and to my surprise I saw an old camera covered in mud. The sound of the whispers changed. They were no longer soft or hypnotic. Now they were frantic, almost furious. My flashlight flickered and went out completely. The darkness became absolute. I tried to turn the light back on, but it wouldn't respond. The whispers grew deafening, filling my ears. Then I felt something graze my arm, cold and wet. Panicked, I ran, tripping over rocks and tumbling to the ground several times. Finally, a faint ray of light appeared. I sprinted toward it, emerging from the tunnel, gasping for air, my hands covered in cuts, my heart pounding as though it might explode. The forest was silent again, but something in the air told me I wasn't alone. I ran back down the trail and didn't stop until I reached my car. That night, I examined the camera I had found. Despite its age, it still had a roll of film inside. The next day, I took it to be developed. When I got the photos back, my hands shook uncontrollably. Most of the images were too damaged to make out anything, but one shot taken inside the tunnel clearly showed a long shadow with eyes that glowed like embers. I've never returned to Lancaster Trail. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I think I hear the whispers in my apartment. The dreams haven't stopped either. It's always the tunnel, always the shadows, always that voice calling my name. And every time, it sounds closer. The next day, I woke up with the unmistakable sensation that something was watching me. The whispers hadn't stayed in the forest. I could feel them in every corner of my apartment. The place felt smaller, darker, as if something invisible were occupying the space with me. I had promised myself I wouldn't think about the tunnel again, but the image of that shadow in the photo kept invading my thoughts. I spent hours staring at it, trying to come up with a logical explanation, maybe a camera glitch or a light effect. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. The following night I heard it again. A distant sound, a whisper, barely audible, coming from the vent in my bedroom. My heart raced as I moved closer. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling my name. In a panic, I sealed all the vents with tape, but it didn't work. The sounds grew louder, more persistent. Then, on Friday night, a letter arrived. Inside, there was only one photo, the entrance to the tunnel, partially obscured by ferns. Without hesitation, I burned the photo. I immediately called Sarah. I was desperate to hear familiar voices that could anchor me back to reality when Sarah answered on the second ring. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "Did you hear something that day near the creek?" I quickly asked. There was an uncomfortable pause before she responded. "I thought I heard something, but I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to scare you more." The line went silent for a few seconds. "Dan, what's going on?" she asked again, but I couldn't respond. My phone slipped from my hand and fell to the ground as an ear-splitting noise echoed through my apartment. Something, or someone, was scraping the wall behind my bed. I turned slowly, my eyes locked on the spot where the sound was coming from. The paint was cracking. I left the phone on the floor and rushed out of the apartment in a panic. I didn't even grab anything, just ran out the door and into the night. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked in a busy area. The next morning, I returned to the apartment to pack only the essentials. The wall in the bedroom now had a crack, about a meter long, as if something had been trying to break through. As I was packing my things into boxes, I found another letter on the kitchen table. It hadn't been there when I left. This time, it wasn't a photo but a handwritten note. "You're closer than you think." That same afternoon, I left the apartment keys at the management office and drove aimlessly for hours. I couldn't stay there anymore. Since then, I've changed addresses twice. I live with the lights on, even when I sleep. But none of that seems to matter. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, I swear I hear whispers, growing closer with each passing moment. The first time I saw something strange was 3 days after I moved in. I had just finished my shower when I noticed that the condensation on the bathroom mirror hadn't formed evenly. Instead of the usual foggy film, there was a clear spot in the exact shape of a perfect circle, right in the center. I thought maybe I cleaned it wrong, or perhaps some product had left residue. I didn't think much of it and continued with my day. But the next day, the circle was back. And this time, it was bigger. I grabbed a towel and tried to wipe it off, but it seemed to be on the other side of the mirror, as though the stain was inside the glass itself. I stared at my reflection for a moment, feeling strangely watched. But by whom? On the third day, while brushing my teeth, something caught my eye in the clear circle of the mirror. I saw movement. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to freeze me in my tracks. I dropped my toothbrush and approached the mirror, inspecting it closely. There was nothing there, just my bathroom behind me. But as I leaned in further, a faint shimmer moved within the circle. It was as if the mirror was reflecting something that wasn't in the room, something that existed behind the glass. That night, I dreamt about the mirror. In my dream, the circle had expanded, covering the entire surface. I was standing in front of it, staring into it. A week after I moved in, I saw someone who wasn't me on the other side of the mirror. The circle in the glass had turned into a window. It wasn't just a clear spot anymore. I could distinguish shapes moving inside it, shadows that didn't match anything in my bathroom. During the day, it appeared dull, but every time I used the bathroom at night, the shadows became clearer. Sometimes I could even swear I heard a faint whisper. One night, after coming back from work, I dared to stand in front of the mirror longer than usual. I turned off the lights and switched on a flashlight, aiming it directly at the glass. The shadow appeared again. But this time, it was sharper. A long, distorted figure with limbs that seemed too long for a human. It had no face, only a smooth surface where the eyes and mouth should be. My heart raced, and I stepped back, but the figure mirrored my movement. It wasn't just a reflection, it moved with a slight delay, as if it was imitating me. At first, it had been small, barely noticeable. But when I ran my finger across it, I felt a chill crawl up my arm. That night, I heard a sharp knock from the bathroom. I got out of bed and went to check, but there was no one there. The mirror, however, seemed different. The crack had grown larger and seemed to stretch into the clear circle. The circle that had been silent until then was now emitting a faint buzzing sound, like the hum of a light bulb about to burn out. I called a friend, Javier, to tell him what was happening. He laughed at first but agreed to come stay with me that night. I showed him the mirror. "I don't see anything unusual," he said, after staring at it for several minutes. I let him stay with the lights off in the bathroom, hoping he would see what I saw. After about 10 minutes, he came out, pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Javier?" I asked, but he didn't respond immediately. Finally, he whispered, "You need to get rid of that mirror." The next day, I decided to remove the mirror. It was heavy, but I managed to take it down and carried it to the shed behind my house. I didn't break it, because something inside me told me that would be a mistake. That night I slept better. But the next day, when I went out to the shed, the mirror was back, hanging in my bathroom. The clear circle was bigger now, and the shadows were sharper. I stopped looking into the mirror,